00041. Helping to give a little closure. Ezekiel spoke up and said, "Welcome to our hidden base. We don't really have a name for it yet. Now, if you would follow me in a moment, I want to get you something to wear and then talk to a few people." Ezekiel looked at Caecilius and said, "I have a few more things I need you to do, if you don't mind." Caecilius nodded yes in reply. So Ezekiel said, "Go grab Steve and Sarah. Ask her if she can show him who Xander Rice and Robert Chandler are. I need them brought back here and taken to the chamber. Once that is done, I want you to join us for something. You can also tell Sarah that she should join us and to bring along Laura as well." Caecilius nodded before he walked out of the room to find Steve and Sarah. As he did, Ezekiel turned to Cecily and said, "If you would follow me, let's get you something to wear." Cecily didn't respond, but followed Ezekiel out of the room and through a wide hallway. After a minute, they came to a secured door, which opened up when Ezekiel grabbed the door handle. Inside was a small armory. They walked inside and Ezekiel walked over to a closet recessed into the wall that had a body mirror next to it. He pulled out a pair of black combat pants, a belt, and a plain black t-shirt before he handed it to Cecily and said, "Sorry, this is all we really have here. Do you need shoes?" Cecily took the clothes and shook her head as she said, "No, this should be fine, thank you." She quickly put on the pants and shirt. The pants almost fit her hips correctly, but the belt helped secure it properly. The t-shirt was too big for her, so she pulled it up some and tied one side of it into a knot, making it look like she was now wearing a crop top. She looked at herself in the mirror for a moment before she nodded her head to herself and turned to look at Ezekiel as she asked, "Now what?" "Now I need to go check with Tobarama and make sure he doesn't need any help. You've said his name a few times. Who is he?" Ezekiel nodded and said, "He is a friend and a ninja." Cecily gave him a flat look, which made Ezekiel smile as he said, "What? It's true. We really are a group of super spies, ninjas, and sorcerers. We just used magic to transport here, and you think ninjas aren't real?" Cecily looked a little confused as she asked, "That was magic? Caecilius isn't a mutant like me? I thought that portal thing was his power." Ezekiel shook his head as he walked out of the room and said, "Nope, that was magic. Caecilius is a master of the mystic arts." "Master of the mystic arts? Is that like his job title or something?" Ezekiel laughed before he said, "No, his official job title is shuttle bus or teacher." Cecily gave Ezekiel another look as they were walking and said, "Really? I doubt you call him a shuttle bus." "I might not call him that, but that is what he is. Think about it, all he did was transport people around today. What would you call that as a job?" Cecily was quiet for a few moments in thought before she asked, "Isn't that called a chauffeur?" As Ezekiel was about to reply, they heard a young girl yelling, "No fair AVA. You can't use your powers for tag, that's cheating." They heard another girl laughing before she appeared through the wall in front of them. A few seconds later, another girl ran out from a door down the hall in front of them as she yelled, "Get back here, you cheater!" The half-invisible girl turned to the other girl and blew a raspberry as she turned solid, before she turned around to run away but stopped in her tracks. She looked at Cecily for a moment, before she ran up to Ezekiel and gave him a hug as she said, "You're back! Where have you been? You said you would play with us today." Ezekiel smiled as he gave Ava a hug back, before he let go and then ruffled her hair a little when he patted her head. He gave her a smirk as he said, "I had some important stuff to do, like making a new friend." Ezekiel pointed next to him and said, "This is Cecily." Ezekiel looked at Cecily and said, "Cecily, this young lady is Ava, and the girl right behind her is Mary." Ava's eyes went wide as she turned around to look at Mary, but it was already too late. Mary touched Ava's arm as she said, "I got you, you cheater." Mary smiled at Cecily and stuck out her hand as she said, "Hi. I am Mary Sue Poots. It's nice to meet you." Cecily smiled slightly as she reached out and shook Mary's hand as she said, "It's nice to meet you. I am Cecily Kincaid." "Oh wow, your hand feels cold. That's neat. Are you made of metal? Oh, are you also an orphan like us?" "Well, Ava isn't really an orphan anymore. She has Uncle Bill." Cecily's body started to shake and deform slightly as Ezekiel quickly put a hand on her shoulder as he said, "It's okay. Just take a breath. Cecily's body stopped deforming after a few moments, before her body hardened again. She put on a weak smile as she said, "Yes, I am now an orphan." Mary looked down at the floor as she said, "Sorry, I didn't mean to upset you." Ezekiel chopped Mary on the head and said, "It's fine, you didn't know. Now both of you run along. We have some stuff we need to do." Both Ava and Mary nodded their heads before they each said, "It was nice to meet you." Then they took off down the hall and ran into the door Mary came out of earlier. As Ezekiel and Cecily started walking again, she asked, "Are there a lot of orphan kids here?" Ezekiel shook his head and said, "Only a few. There is a lot more at Xavier's school. You would be surprised how many people just abandon or disown their kids when they find out they are mutants." It became quiet after that as they walked down the hallways for a few minutes. Ezekiel stopped at a door and opened it up. Inside the room were about 15 people. A few were grouped together working on different projects. A few were alone reading books. The rest of them seemed to be talking about something. The group that was talking together is who Ezekiel walked towards, with Cecily following behind him. "Tobarama, I know it was short notice, but did you finish them?" Tobarama turned around and answered, "Yes, I just finished. But I thought you wanted to use this sparingly." Another person spoke up and asked, "I also thought that is what we agreed on." Ezekiel nodded, but then said, "Slight change of plans. 2 more won't hurt." 2 more this time. What about next time?" Ezekiel let out a sigh and said, "Hopefully there won't be a next time, but I will make that call on a person-to-person basis." "Any other complaints, Orochimaru?" Orochimaru huffed a little before his tongue slipped out of the side of his mouth and flickered there for a moment. When he pulled his tongue back and he said, "No, but make sure you remember. We are in this together. If something happens and you die, we also die." Ezekiel laughed as he said, "You should also keep that in mind if the next project works." Ezekiel turned to Cecily and said, "Sorry, Cecily. Let me introduce you to Orochimaru, Tobarama, and Kabuto. They might look a little funny, but they are some of the smartest people you will ever meet." Kabuto pushed up his glasses as he said, "It's nice to meet you. I am Kabuto." Tobarama bowed his head slightly and said, "It's a pleasure. I am Tobarama Senju." Orochimaru's eyes narrowed a little as he eyed Cecily up and down as he said, "I am Orochimaru, and you look absolutely delicious." His tongue flicked out of his mouth a little as he finished. Ezekiel let out a long sigh as he said, "Stop being a creep, Petamaru. You're going to scare her." Ezekiel looked back at Cecily and said, "Sorry about Petamaru. He has issues acting like a normal person." Cecily just nodded in response, but also took a step back and moved slightly behind Ezekiel. Ezekiel frowned a little and looked back at Orochimaru, who he gave a glare to as he said, "There is a reason so many people think you are a creep. Try to tone it down a little." He then looked at Tobarama and said, "Let's go to the chamber. Steve should be on his way already." Tobarama nodded and walked towards the door with Orochimaru and Kabuto. Ezekiel followed next with Cecily next to him. It took them a minute, but they made it to the chamber and saw Steve carrying 2 people, one on each shoulder. Next to him was Kaiselius with Sarah and Laura following slightly behind them both. Ezekiel stopped at the door to the chamber with Cecily and waited for Steve and the rest. When they got close, Ezekiel smiled and said, "Hope you don't mind the light workout?" Steve smiled back and said, "This doesn't even count as a warm-up." Steve glanced at Cecily, who was next to Ezekiel, as he asked, "You sure about doing this? I know you said there could be issues if we do this too much." Ezekiel gave a wide grin as he said, "Doing the right thing isn't really a choice, is it?" Steve gave his 1,000-watt smile as he said, "No, no it isn't." Ezekiel pointed to Cecily and said, "Steve, I would like you to meet Cecily Kincaid." Ezekiel pointed at Steve and said, "Cecily, this is a friend of mine, Steve Rogers." Cecily smiled slightly and said, "It's nice to meet you." Steve gave a slight nod as he said, "Pleasure to meet you. If you will excuse me, I need to hand these guys over to Tobarama." Cecily nodded as Steve walked inside along with Kaiselius, while Sarah walked up to Ezekiel with a frown. She said in a slightly hushed voice, "How in the hell is Steve Rogers here, and how come he doesn't look like he has aged a day?" Cecily and Laura both looked a little confused as Ezekiel smiled and said, "I will tell you after we finalize your deal to stay here. Right now we have something important to do." Ezekiel extended his hand towards the door as he said, "After you." Sarah, Laura, and Cecily walked into the room followed by Ezekiel. The inside of the room was plain with no decorations. There was an intricate pattern drawn on the floor with 2 tables in the middle. Strapped down on each table were the men that Steve had brought in. Each of them were secured tightly to the table, and both had a ball gag in their mouth. Steve, Kaiselius, Sarah, Laura, and Cecily were off to one side of the room, while Orochimaru, Tobarama, and Kabuto were double-checking everything. Ezekiel walked over to the 2 people on the tables and gave each of them a solid slap to wake them up. They groggily came around, but Xander was more aware and was staring daggers at Ezekiel. Ezekiel gave him a wicked grin as he said, "Don't worry, Xander, this is the last time you will ever see me. Now don't blink, you don't want to miss what happens." Ezekiel stepped back to the group as he said, "All right, start with Robert first. Then you can start Xander after 30 seconds. Tobarama nodded as he started to do some hand signs before he said, "Kuchios, Edo Tensei." As he placed a hand over the first man's head that had a seal on it, the man started to thrash around as his skin started to flake off his body and fall towards a small petri dish on the floor. Everyone was quiet, even Xander, as he stared in wide-eyed horror at what was happening to the man next to him. After half a minute, Tobarama repeated the process on Xander, who joined the other man as they both wailed in agony. Sarah, Cecily, and Kaiselius were watching in shock what was happening, while Laura looked almost indifferent to it. When both men finally finished screaming, Ezekiel turned to Cecily and said, "Cecily, once this is finished, you will only have 48 hours. So make the best of the time you have." Cecily, Sarah, Kaiselius, and Laura all looked at Ezekiel in confusion after he spoke. Cecily asked after a moment, "I don't understand. What's going to happen in 48 hours? Ezekiel pointed to the 2 piles of ash that were taking shape as he said, "It's when this spell ends." Cecily watched quietly as the piles of ash slowly formed into a man and woman. Sarah let out a gasp after a moment, and Cecily began to shake as her body began to deform. Ezekiel's hand grasped her shoulder as he said calmly, "You only have 48 hours. Make the best of this you can." Cecily's voice cracked as she asked, "AM? I'm not dreaming, right? Please don't let this be a dream." Ezekiel squeezed her shoulder a little as he said, "This isn't a dream, but you do have a time limit. I wish I could do more for you, but this is the best I can do." Cecily didn't reply, but her body was hardening slowly. After a minute, the woman's eyes opened as she yelled, "Just tell me what you did to my daughter." After that, she looked around in shock before her eyes focused on Cecily, and she ran forward, embracing her in a tight hug as she said, "Thank God you are okay, sweetie. Those terrible people didn't do anything to you, did they?" As the woman was hugging Cecily, the man opened his eyes and yelled out, "You cowards! Tell me where my daughter and wife are." He pulled up his hands to fight, before he stopped as he saw his wife hugging Cecily. He quickly moved next to them and embraced them both in a bear hug. None of them talked after that for a few moments before Ezekiel finally said, "I don't want to break up this family reunion, but you are on a time limit." Cecily was the first to release her hug, and her mother and father followed suit right after. Cecily looked at her parents for another moment before she glanced at Ezekiel and asked, "How is this even possible?" Ezekiel shook his head as he said, "That doesn't matter right now. What matters is your parents are here now, and you need to make the best of it." Ezekiel turned to Cecily's parents and said, "Mr. and Mrs. Kincaid, it's great to meet you. If you and your daughter will follow my friend Kaiselius, he will take you to a very nice island that you can enjoy with your daughter for the next couple days." Cecily grabbed both of her parents' hands before they could talk as she said, "I will tell you everything that happened when we get to this island." Ezekiel glanced at Kaiselius and said, "I know you have a question." "Yes, I will, but you will have the same time limit. Now, if you wouldn't mind transporting them, we can hash out the details later." Kaiselius' eyes had the slightest hint of moisture in them as he nodded his head before he started to walk out of the room. Cecily smiled at Ezekiel for a moment before she dragged her parents out of the room following Kaiselius. Everyone could hear them start bombarding Cecily with questions as they walked away. As Ezekiel turned around, Sarah asked, "What in the fuck was that?" Ezekiel grinned as he said, summoning impure world reincarnation. It basically shreds the target's soul and uses it to bring back the target's soul for a limited time. Sarah just stared at Ezekiel but couldn't think of what to say. He smiled back at her as he said, I have a speech I need to proofread. If you have questions, ask Tobarama. He is the crazy person who made the technique. 00042. Hero or villain. It started off as a normal day for most people around the world. That was until anything that was remotely connected to the internet started to act up by posting the old style, please stand by message. Televisions were next, followed by radios. Everything that could was repeating the same message. The only thing that was not targeted was airplanes. After a few minutes of the message being broadcast, most of the world stopped to see what was happening. Computers, televisions, anything that had a working screen that could pick up the transmitted signal finally changed. It was all black at first before it slowly faded in showing a man wearing a red and purple helmet. As the man began to speak, everything that received the transmission, which had speakers, began to play perfectly translated audio of what he said. My name is Max Eisenhardt, better known to most of the world as the mutant terrorist Magneto. Magneto paused and removed his helmet as the video feed zoomed out a little to show Magneto seated in a chair. He was wearing a very nice fitted dark gray colored three-piece suit, which complemented his silver-colored hair nicely. After placing the helmet to the side, he looked back at the camera as he said, I am using this broadcast today to clear up some mistakes I have made over the years that have caused me to be labeled as a terrorist. Magneto paused for a moment and looked up towards the ceiling. After a few moments, he let out a sigh, then looked back towards the camera as he said, I had a whole speech made for this, but I am not going to use it. The speech wasn't good and would just be a waste of everyone's time, and I could sum up the whole thing in a single sentence. I am a hypocrite. Magneto shook his head as he said, in trying to protect mutants, I slowly became something I hate to the very fiber of my being, and I didn't even realize it. Not until recently, that is. Magneto had a faraway look on his face as his eyes became slightly unfocused as he said, when I was a boy, my family fled from Nazi Germany to Warsaw, Poland. We were unlucky and ended up stuck there in the Warsaw Ghetto after Germany invaded. After a while, we were eventually able to escape. But the bad luck didn't end and my family was caught soon after we escaped along with some friends of our family. The video zoomed in showing only Magneto's face where you could see the light sheen in the corner of his eyes. His voice cracked just the tiniest bit as he said, they executed my entire family. I only survived because of my father, who pushed me into the pit behind us as they started to shoot. I was left covered in the bodies of my family and friends for over a day before I was able to claw my way out. You could almost say I was lucky because they didn't fill in the pit when they finished tossing all the bodies in. Magneto blinked a few times and his eyes became more focused as he looked back at the camera, which zoomed back out to show him sitting in the chair again. He took a deep breath before he said, it didn't take long for some Nazis to find me and throw me into the Auschwitz-Birkenau camp. As he talked, he raised up his left arm and slid his sleeve up. The camera zoomed in on his arm to show a faded tattoo that read AB 24005. The camera zoomed back out slowly as Magneto pulled his sleeve back down before he said, when I was there, I worked as a Sonderkommando, and it was where I witnessed firsthand the horrors man can inflict on each other, just for someone being different from them. It was there I learned the true brutality that humans were capable of. His eyes unfocused slightly, remembering something as he said, it was there that I promised myself I would be better than the people who imprisoned me, that all humans are equal and should be treated with respect and dignity, that I would never become like the people who were keeping me in shackles. He let out a hollow laugh as he said, how well I did trying to keep that promise. Magneto shook his head as he said, I am not really sure how I survived the next few years when so many people around me died, but I clung on to life stubbornly and somehow I survived that hell. It was sometime after I was released that I finally awakened my powers. Magneto held his right hand out and his helmet lifted up and began to float around his hand as he said, it was also when I started going down the wrong path and becoming like the people I hate. When I gained my powers, I thought foolishly that I was somehow chosen, that I was somehow better than everyone else who didn't have powers. It was my hubris that was slowly turning me into what I hated, and I never even noticed. Magneto's helmet floated back down and he put his arm back on the chair as he said, It wasn't too long before I met another person like me, and we became close friends. We spent countless hours in debate on how mutants and humans should interact. They argued for peaceful coexistence, while my early life made me believe that coexistence would never work. I believed that humans were too short-sighted, were too quick to judge, that they would always hate anything different from themselves. How right I was in my argument, and yet so wrong. Magneto chuckled for a moment before he said, "Me and my friend parted ways after a while. They had their own goals and ambitions, which were very different from my own. They went on trying to work peacefully with humans and to make a better world. I spent time hunting down ex-Nazis and looking for other mutants under the fake name, Eric Magnus Lencher. It was during this time that I met a few mutants who thought like me. So we decided to form a group to find more like-minded people like us." Magneto shook his head and said, "In hindsight, it was a terrible idea. The echo chamber that was created from all of us being together just fueled my beliefs that mutants were superior to man. That coexistence would never work, and it would be better if mutants being the superior race were to rule over humanity." Magneto looked sad as he said, "Sounds a lot like a certain group that took over Germany many years ago. And when I look back on my past actions, I realize now I was becoming just like that group." Magneto shook his head again as he said, "It was my arrogance, my unwavering belief that I knew better because I had seen humans at their worst, that only I had what it took to lead mutants to a better future. All these years I worked towards my goal, and what do I have to show for it?" He frowned a little as he said, "I have nothing but regrets. Everything I did. If I had just taken the time to think logically, to consider what my actions look like to everyone else, maybe I would have actually achieved something. Instead, I am now labeled as a terrorist, and in the words of someone I met recently, the mutant equivalent to Hitler." Magneto took a deep breath and then said, "I cannot fix my past actions, and I won't ask for forgiveness for them either. But I want the world to know that going forward, I no longer see the fake line I made between mutants and humans. While I might have powers compared to other people, I can be just as short-sighted, judgmental, and narrow-minded as everyone else in the world." Magneto looked humble as he said, "I am the same fallible human as you are, and I wish to say that I am sorry." Magneto bowed his head for a few moments and was silent. When he looked back up, his face was hard as he said, "I still plan to fight for my fellow humans that have powers. But moving forward, me and the people I work with will be completely transparent in our actions and motivations." On the bottom of the screen, a website address appeared, and after it did, Magneto said, "Early this morning, I worked with a group of people to destroy a facility that was kidnapping people with powers and their immediate families. We were lucky enough to rescue a handful of people, but we were unlucky because they had been in operation for years." Magneto gave a slightly sad smile as he said, "After our successful rescue operation, we executed everyone who worked for that facility for their crimes and completely destroyed the base itself. We will not disclose the employees' names to protect their family from people looking for payback, but we did inform their families of their deaths." He let out a tired sigh as he said, "The website below has a complete list of everyone that they kidnapped, tortured, and killed over the years. I would encourage anyone who has missing friends or family to check the website. The amount of people they took over their few years of operation is staggering." Pictures of the missing people are also on the website to make it slightly easier for people to identify them. To the families who would wish to bury their dead, I am sorry to say that we have no bodies to give you." Magneto's eyes narrowed just slightly as he said, "While we were able to take care of this facility today, we weren't able to take care of the people who were funding them and still have no clue who they really are. It won't stop us from looking for them and others like them. From now on, any action the people I work with take will be posted on this website, along with any information we deem important public knowledge, like the list of victims we currently have up." Magneto relaxed a little as he said, "I don't want anyone to think we are trying to purposely hide information. Anything not deemed important public knowledge will be held back because of respect for the dead. The general public really doesn't need to see the videos we found in that place. It made my time in the camps look like a weekend holiday." Magneto put on a smile as he said, "To everyone who watched or listened to this broadcast, thank you for your time." The video feed slowly faded to black before every television went back to whatever it should be playing. All radios went back to normal and computers were back to normal, except they were opened up to the website that was linked during Magneto's broadcast. During the broadcast, everyone who owned a relay station, network substation, satellite, or anything else that was sending out the signals was frantically trying to restore control of their systems. But nothing they did helped unless they completely cut the power, and only a few people tried that method. Within an hour of the broadcast, smarter news agencies were making special reports about the broadcast and the website that was posted. What they found when checking the website was that the missing people were from all over the world. Almost 150,000 people were posted on the website, and the outrage from the general public was massive. The fact that someone labeled as a terrorist was the one who stopped this group of people was also under debate. Some people were celebrating him, and the people he worked with as heroes. Others thought that they acted as vigilantes and should have gone to the proper authorities with the information they had and to let them handle it. Yet another group was calling Magneto and the people he worked with as terrorists and murderers, that they killed innocent people, and that everything on the website was mutant lies. That they themselves kidnapped all those people and were just trying to hide the truth. There was even a group that was upset that this group of people killing mutants was now gone. While the general public was outraged about the news, most governments around the world just posted blank statements about what happened and that they didn't support his actions but didn't condemn them either. But behind the scenes, they didn't appreciate what Magneto and the website represented, and they were doing their best to track down where the website was hosted to take it down. Others were trying to block access to the site, but everything they attempted didn't work. As soon as they implemented something, it would somehow just disappear and the site would still be accessible. Most governments spent hours trying different things before they finally gave up. Only one government was different from the rest and praised Magneto for his actions. Israel made a statement saying that Magneto was always welcome to come home whenever he wanted, and they would gladly refuse anybody who wanted him captured for extradition. There was one person in the world that was more surprised than the rest of the world when the broadcast happened. He knew about the facility and that it would be dealt with, but he didn't know about this little stunt, and it caught him completely by surprise. As soon as the broadcast started, he walked out of his office and yelled, "Someone find me Coulson and Hill immediately!" Fury slammed his office door and walked back to his desk and slumped into his chair. As he watched the broadcast with Magneto, he let out a sigh and opened the bottom drawer of his desk. He pulled out a bottle of whiskey and a glass. After filling the glass most of the way, he looked at it for a moment as his phone started to ring, and after a few seconds, every line on his phone was blinking red. He looked at the phone, looked at his glass of whiskey, before he lifted the bottle of whiskey and took a drink from it instead. Today was going to be a shit show after this, and he really didn't want to deal with it. He planned to have a long talk with Ezekiel after he was finished dealing with this mess. 00043. Fallout and a Furious Fury. The next 2 days were pretty peaceful for Ezekiel, considering what was happening with the rest of the world. The first thing he did was talk with Sarah, and they hammered out the deal of her working with him and his group. It was simple, really. She just wanted an actual guarantee that he wouldn't change the deal at some point. So he introduced her to the Ancient One and asked Tao to make a binding contract of magic about the deal they made. Sarah didn't really seem to believe it, but she seemed more relaxed after her, and Ezekiel signed it. Unfortunately, Ezekiel had to sign the contract in person and also had to use his real name. But there was a clause in the contract that his name was hidden, and anyone who looked at it would only see Ezekiel as his name. After Sarah signed the contract, she started to bombard Ezekiel with questions, and he just pointed her to one of the computer terminals. Before he left her, he did remind her to go visit her sister and to take Laura with her, or her niece will have issues when she is older. She agreed, but only after everything died down. As for Laura, well, she quickly met the other kids, or it would be better to say they met her. She was quiet and didn't really know how to interact with them properly. But Ava and Mary were both balls of positive energy and did everything they could to get Laura to interact with them and the other kids. It was a work in progress, to say the least. Another thing Ezekiel did was talk with Kaisalius about bringing back his family. Ezekiel and Tobarama were very clear with him that it would only work once, and that he would only have 48 hours with them, as the spell would collapse after that. Kaisalius agreed, and after a few hours Tobarama brought back his wife and son. Kaisalius said he wanted to spend time with them at their favorite place and left the base with them shortly after they were summoned. Ezekiel then spent the next day or so playing with everyone, trying to either find, block, or just take down his website. He already had a program that took care of it automatically, but it was fun to do it himself. He might have gotten a bit carried away and tricked a bunch of different government agencies into hacking their own servers to find the server/shut it down. But at the moment, he didn't have that much on his plate and wanted to unwind a little before Fury came to chew him out for not disclosing what he had done with Magneto. At almost 48 hours from when Cecily's parents were summoned, Ezekiel had Tau transport him to the island they were on. The time difference made it so that it was actually coming up on sunset when Ezekiel arrived. He found Cecily being hugged from each side by her parents as they watched the sunset together. As the sun was fading over the horizon, Cecily's parents started to slowly disintegrate. Each of them said something to her before they both kissed one of her cheeks as they finished disappearing into motes of light and ash that drifted off on the ocean breeze. Cecily didn't move, but continued to watch the pink and red-colored sky alone. Ezekiel approached her as the light began to fade and the faintest of stars could be seen in the twilight of sunset. He asked her, "Mind if I join you?" Cecily didn't respond at first, but then patted the sand next to her. Ezekiel sat down in the sand next to her, but said nothing else. After a moment, Cecily leaned into Ezekiel and rested her head on his shoulder. They sat there for over an hour in silence, just watching the sky fully transition into night. Sometime later, Cecily finally spoke and said, "I'll never be able to thank you properly for what you did." Ezekiel reached over and clasped her hand gently as he said, "You don't need to." They sat quietly together for a while longer before a portal opened close by and Mordo walked out of it before it closed again. He looked at Ezekiel as he said, "Sorry to interrupt, but Fury is looking for you, and he seems more upset than he usually is." Ezekiel let out a sigh as he said, "Looks like I have to go back to work. Do you want to come with us, or stay here longer?" Cecily lifted her head off his shoulder as she said, "I think I'll join you, if that's okay." Ezekiel stood up and helped Cecily up afterwards as he said, "You won't be able to join me when I am with Fury, but you can go meet Ava, Mary, and the rest if you like." Cecily nodded her head before she said, "All right." Ezekiel looked at Mordo and let out a chuckle as he asked, "So would you say Fury is currently furious?" Mordo gave him a flat look, and Cecily nudged Ezekiel with her shoulder as she said, "That was lame. Everyone's a critic these days." Mordo said nothing but opened a portal for them. Ezekiel went through first, followed by Cecily, and then Mordo, who closed the portal after them. When they arrived in the transfer room, Ezekiel glanced at Mordo and asked, "Mordo, would you be able to show Cecily where the kids normally hang out? I don't want to keep Fury waiting too long." Mordo nodded and said, "Yes." Ezekiel smiled as he looked at Cecily and said, "Cecily, this is Mordo. He doesn't talk much but otherwise isn't bad company." Before either of them could say anything, an afterimage of Ezekiel faded away. Cecily's mouth was hanging open before she looked at Mordo and asked, "He can teleport?" Mordo shook his head and said, "No idea." Before he started to walk out of the room and down the hall, Cecily just shook her head and mumbled, "He really doesn't talk much," as she went to follow him. VVVVV. Fury was seated in a chair in the conference room they used for meetings. He wasn't happy. The last 2 days had been so much work, and he wasn't even close to sorting through the mess that had been made. Every attempt to take down Ezekiel's website had ended in failure, and after the second time, the team assigned to the task was sure they had it and pulled the plug. They only ended up destroying another of the servers S.H.I.E.L.D. owned. So Fury put a stop to the project even though the World Security Council was breathing down his neck for results. They wanted the site removed and whoever was behind it found and detained for questioning. But the worst part is he had Alexander Pierce with him most of the time the last day and a half. He couldn't get away to come find out what the fuck Ezekiel was thinking, pulling a stunt like this. This is why he hated working with third parties and people not under his direct command. He couldn't control them easily. If he had some dirt on Ezekiel, or maybe knew who he really was, he could use that as some type of leverage to keep him in line. But currently the only thing he knew for sure was that he was somehow reincarnated and was currently a 3-year-old kid. Fury let out a sigh as the door to the conference room opened up and Ezekiel walked in with a big smile on his face. When Ezekiel saw Fury, he said in a cheerful voice, "Mordo said you looked upset, but you look pretty normal to me." Fury gave Ezekiel a flat look and pointed at the chair across from him as he said, "Sit. Then I want you to tell me what the fuck you were thinking pulling a stunt like that." As Ezekiel sat down, he asked, I am not really sure what you're talking about. Could you be more clear on the stunt you were talking about? Fury slammed his right fist down on the table as he yelled, I don't have time for your games, Ezekiel. You know damn well what I'm talking about. Ezekiel shook his head as he said, I have an idea, but I am not really sure if it was the broadcast with Magneto, the website, me tricking your team into destroying your own servers, bringing back Cecily's parents, or bringing back Kaisalia's family. So which one did you want to talk about? Fury's right eye twitched a little as he asked in a calmer voice, You mind repeating that last bit? I think I just misheard you. Ezekiel smiled and said, What? The part about bringing back Cecily's parents or Kaisalia's family? Fury's voice was ice cold as he asked, I thought you said you had to use that spell sparingly or something bad might happen. Ezekiel nodded his head as he said, That is correct. I had always planned to help out Kaisalius, so that was planned on my part. The man can be a powerful asset, but he needed closure with his family, so I gave that to him. Fury nodded his head slightly as he listened. It made sense and was honestly a smart move for Ezekiel. But then Ezekiel said, As for Cecily, she has no immediate family and just awakened her powers recently. She was blaming herself for her parents' murder, and while she could have worked through it with time and therapy, I figured the best cure was hearing from her parents that they didn't blame her and that they still loved her very much. Seemed to work. She already seems better. So you wanted her as another asset? What are her powers? Ezekiel shook his head as he said, No, I am not even sure if she will join us yet. I was just trying to help a young girl who was lost. I did give her a choice of joining us or going to Xavier. But whether or not she becomes an asset is up to her. I won't force her to do anything. Fury's eyes narrowed the tiniest bit and he asked, So what are we going to do if she wants to leave? She would be a security risk if she got out. Ezekiel nodded slightly as he said, Normally you would be right, but if she decided to leave, I would just have to lock away and hide certain memories. Nothing that will affect her well-being and will keep us safe. Fury gave a quick laugh before he said, You think that stunt with Magneto and that website is safe for us? What if someone is able to trace it back to us? No one in the world is good enough to do that. Also, that website might seem big and need a server to store and run the whole thing. But I have it running off of a satellite I commandeered from some people who didn't need it. So if someone was able to find where the website is really hosted, it would be on a satellite that doesn't actually exist. Fury sat back a little in his chair as he asked, What about that stupid stunt with Magneto? Ezekiel grinned as he said, What better way to hide than to have someone else being big and flashy? We can slowly take down some targets, and we do it under the guise of Magneto and his group. It does paint a big target on his back, but when I explained what I wanted to do, he agreed to take up the position. But he did make a demand in return. Fury felt a headache coming on as he asked, Do I even want to know? Ezekiel laughed as he said, It's fine, he just wanted a country for mutants. Fury gave Ezekiel a flat look as he repeated, He just wants a country? Ezekiel nodded as he said, Yup, just a single country. I thought it was reasonable, so I said yes. Fury stood up and planted his hands on the table in front of him as he yelled, And how the fuck are you going to give him a country? I am not sure, but I will figure it out. I just need to find one that will work. Probably an island nation or something would work best. A good old-fashioned coup should work, I think. Fury pointed a figure at Ezekiel as he yelled, You can't just take over a country. The UN wouldn't allow it. SHIELD wouldn't allow it. You think you can just take over a whole country in a day or something? Ezekiel nodded his head as he said, If it was small enough, yes. We would need enough manpower, though. Fury started to pace as he was yelling, Are you out of your goddamn mind? Do you really think that if you could make a coup happen in a single day and somehow take over a country, the rest of the world would let you keep it? You know, you don't need to yell so much. I can hear you just fine. Fury turned around to glare at Ezekiel as he said, I don't think you have been listening to anything I am saying. You can't take over a country. Ezekiel asked, I know. You have said that a bunch. So what? You want me to give him Mars instead and show him how to terraform the planet instead? Because I can, and then we shouldn't have any issue. Fury studied Ezekiel for a few moments before he let out a sigh and asked in a defeated voice, So I assume you have a country in mind already? Ezekiel smiled as he nodded, Yes. The island nation of Genosha. 00044. The first metahuman influencer? Kurt was depressed. He had asked for permission to post videos on the new website that came out recently. Unfortunately, he was told not to post anything. If someone hacked the site, they could possibly track him down. Since they would be tracking him back to the school, he was told not to post anything because it was a security risk for everyone at the school, especially since that broadcast that Magneto had made. While a lot of people were happy, it seemed like even more had started to come out against mutants in the last few weeks. Kurt wanted to start a video series on the new media platform and show the world that mutants were just like everyone else. They might look different, they might have powers, but mutants were just as human as the next person. When he was denied from posting videos, he went to his best friend Kitty. He asked her to hack into the new platform to see how secure it was. He knew if she had issues hacking into the site, then it should be fine to post videos. What they didn't expect was Kitty's computer to be taken over after only a minute or so of her trying to find a way into the site. Her computer screen went dark for a moment, and a small chibi person appeared on the screen. He raised his finger and said, "Ah, you didn't say the magic word. Ah, you didn't say the magic word." The problem was it wasn't just her computer that was doing this. They could hear it coming from the rooms around them and other students asking what was going on. Kitty looked at Kurt as she said, "I think I messed up." Kurt looked worried as he asked, "This is bad. Can you fix it?" Kitty shook her head as she said, "No, I am locked out of my computer. Maybe if I shut it down and restart it, I might be able to fix it. But it might also ruin my computer." Kurt had a regretful look as he said, "Sorry, Kitty." Kitty smiled back at Kurt as she said, "Let's go talk to the professor and tell him what happened. I am sure he can get it fixed." Kurt's tail curled down and tucked behind him as he said, "But we'll get in trouble. You know the professor doesn't like you hacking into things, and since I was the one to ask, I will be in more trouble than you." Kitty smiled as she grabbed onto Kurt's hand as she said, "You should have thought about that before you asked me. I didn't think something like this would happen." Kitty started to become intangible along with Kurt. Once they were both completely intangible, she said, "Doesn't matter now. It's already done. Come on, let's go." Bamf! Both of them disappeared in a cloud of bluish-black smoke that smelled like sulfur. They appeared the next moment in Professor Xavier's office with another bamf. As they appeared, they heard someone saying, "I have no idea why he would mess with the computers again." Kitty and Kurt were in the professor's office and were standing inside the chairs in front of the professor's desk. Henry McCoy, better known as Beast, was standing next to Xavier and looking at the computer in front of them. They were just chatting about school issues when the computers around the school started going crazy. Xavier smiled when he saw Kitty and Kurt and said, "I know the computers are messing up. We will get it fixed soon." Kitty and Kurt walked out of the chairs, and then Kitty made both of them tangible again as she said, "Sorry, Professor. It was my fault." Kurt really wanted to post videos to that new media site, so I tried to hack into it to make sure it was secure enough. Now all the computers are going crazy. Xavier shared a glance with Beast and said, "Well, that solves the mystery of why. Now we just need to contact Ezekiel to fix it." Kitty and Kurt shared a questioning look before they looked back at Xavier again as Kitty asked, "You know who did this, Professor?" Xavier smiled as he said, "From my understanding, you and Kurt were the ones who did this. As for the person who programmed this, yes, I know him." Both Kitty and Kurt looked embarrassed as they lowered their heads a little. Kurt said, "Sorry, Professor. I didn't think something like this would happen." Xavier smiled as he looked up to Beast and said, "It looks to me that you just found the 2 helpers you need for kitchen duty for the next 2 weeks." Kurt was the first to speak as he said, "But Kitty burns everything she makes." Kitty smacked him in the back of his head right after he finished speaking and said, "I do not. I can make a bowl of cereal just fine." Kurt rubbed the back of his head as he said, "You burn toast using a toaster. How was I supposed to know that turning the dials all the way up would burn the toast? I thought it was a timer." Xavier cleared his throat as he said, "You won't have to cook, just help with setup and cleaning. You will be expected to show up at 6 a.m. to help with breakfast, 12 p.m. for lunch, and 5 p.m. for dinner. You will still have to attend your normal classes and make sure all of your homework is done." Another voice spoke up from the computer and said, "Since you had Kitty try to hack into my site, you and Kitty also have to shoot, edit, and upload at least one video during that time, or I will ban both of you from the site for life." Everyone looked at the computer on Xavier's desk. Kitty and Kurt couldn't see the screen, but Ezekiel was on the screen smiling at Xavier and Beast. Kurt was the first to react, and he bamfed in between Xavier and Beast as he said, "Please don't ban me and Kitty. We didn't mean to upset you." As Kurt was talking, Kitty phased through the desk to stand next to him and see who was on the screen. Beast raised an eyebrow at the kid's actions, but said nothing as Ezekiel chuckled before he said, "All you have to do is shoot a video and upload it within 2 weeks. It won't be that hard. Here I will even make it easy for you." The computer screen went back to normal. Xavier let out a sigh as the kids were trying to figure out what Ezekiel meant. Beast spoke up and asked, "He isn't going to do what I think." A portal appeared as Beast was in the middle of talking, and Ezekiel stepped out of it. In his arms he carried an oversized cardboard box. Following behind him was Shui, who also had another box the same size. Ezekiel set his stuff on the ground in front of Xavier's desk between the chairs, and Shui set the box he carried next to it. As they finished, Tao walked out of the portal and it closed behind her. Ezekiel smiled at everyone as he said, "I was planning to come by today. This just gave me a reason to visit sooner." Kitty and Kurt were both stunned because they didn't expect someone to just show up in the professor's office, let alone 3 people. Xavier had a slight smile as he said, "I would say this is unexpected, but it's you after all." Ezekiel grinned wide before he looked at Beast and said, "It's nice to meet you in person, Mr. McCoy." Beast nodded in return and said, "Same to you, Ezekiel. Pleasure to see you again, the Ancient One." He looked at Tao as he spoke and nodded his head before he looked at Shui as he asked, "And who might you be?" Shui bowed as he said, "Shui Uchiha. It's nice to meet all of you." Kurt spoke next as he put his arm around Kitty and said, "I'm Kurt Wagner, and this is my best friend Kitty Pride. It's a pleasure to meet you." Ezekiel smiled and asked, "Kurt, I understand you want to make and upload videos to my site, correct?" Kurt smiled as he said, "Yes, I was hoping to make some videos showing that mutants and humans aren't that different." Ezekiel nodded as he said, "That's a great idea. I was hoping some people would do something like that." Ezekiel pointed to the boxes in front of the desk and said, "If Xavier is okay with it, you and Kitty can have all this stuff so you can make videos." Both Kitty and Kurt glanced at the boxes in front of the desk, but couldn't figure out what was inside the oversized cardboard boxes. Xavier looked at the boxes also before he looked at Ezekiel and said, "You didn't really give me much of a choice, did you?" Ezekiel smirked as he said, "Sorry, I was just excited. Kurt is the first metahuman who wants to make and upload videos. I figured I could help him out. Plus, I had all of this stuff set aside from when I was testing the site and no longer have a need for it." Xavier let out a sigh before he said, "All right, Kurt, Kitty, you can have whatever Ezekiel brought you. What do you say?" They said, "Thank you very much," at the same time. Ezekiel chuckled as he said, "It's fine. Like I said, I no longer had a use for it." Ezekiel looked at Shui and said, "Could you help them take it to their rooms?" Shui nodded as he picked up the box he set down. Kurt bamfed to the other box and picked it up as he said, "I could probably teleport them both. You don't have to help carry them." Shui shook his head as he said, "It's fine. I don't mind at all." He walked next to the door as he said, "Lead the way." Kitty phased through the desk and chair before she reached the door and opened it up as she said, "All right, follow us, Shui." After they left the room, Ezekiel sat in one of the chairs as he looked towards Xavier and said, "I would like to see you and Magneto in a few days at our last meeting spot if you have time." Xavier nodded his head but asked, "What time?" "Anytime. Just message me and I will get you transport. It shouldn't take more than an hour or so." Ezekiel looked at Beast and said, "I also have a project coming up that I could use your skill in genetics and biochemistry if you would like to join it. You can join Xavier and Magneto when they visit and meet the other people who will be working on the project and check out the lab we are using." Beast nodded his head and said, "I have duties with the school, but I could spare some time each week, if that works for you." Ezekiel smiled and said, "Any help would be appreciated." Ezekiel lost his normal smile as he said, "Like I said, giving Kurt and Kitty that stuff isn't the main reason I came. I actually planned to pick up Logan. I promised him something, and I am now ready to fulfill that promise." Xavier had a frown as he said, "Logan said you were going to torture Stryker for him." Beast looked concerned after hearing Xavier speak, but said nothing as Ezekiel gave a slight smile and said, You and Logan are making it sound so bad. I am not going to torture Stryker. I am not some kind of psychopath. Both Beast and Xavier relaxed after Ezekiel finished. But then Ezekiel's grin became wider as he said, all I am going to do is shred his soul. Unfortunately, the side effect is that it is extremely painful. Beast looked at Ezekiel in shock, and Xavier had a concerned look on his face before he asked, I assume that was a joke? Tao shook her head as she said, I have watched him perform it once. While it does shred the target's soul, it doesn't destroy it. It just makes it incredibly weak once the process is finished. As for the person themselves, it looks to be extremely painful to go through, and the target dies before it's finished. Beast frowned as he said, putting the point about souls being real aside. Why would you use something like that? I saw the data you sent from that place. I won't argue with killing those people, but should we really torture them? Xavier nodded his head as he said, as much as I dislike killing, I also think torture is going too far. Ezekiel gave a shoulder shrug as he said, unfortunately, they are serving a purpose in death, and it only works if we use it on them while they are still alive. As for what that purpose is, I can't currently tell you. Xavier stared at Ezekiel for a few moments before he let out a sigh and said, I will call Logan for you. Logan, Ezekiel is in my office. He came to pick you up. Already heading that way, I ran into Kurt and Kitty with someone who doesn't smell like Ezekiel. I am bringing him back with me. We'll be there in a few minutes. Logan said he is coming back with Shui. Ezekiel nodded his head and was about to speak when Bamf, Kurt, and Kitty appeared in the room off to the side this time, and not in anything or anyone. Kitty was the first to speak as she became tangible again and asked, we can really have all that stuff? Ezekiel smiled and said, yup, I don't have a use for it anymore. Kitty looked almost panicked as she sputtered out, but that's… really? Are you sure? Promise? Kurt smiled as he said, Kitty, calm down before you phase through the floor again. But you don't understand. Xavier was curious and said, Miss Pride, please calm yourself and then tell us what has made you so animated. Kitty closed her eyes as she took a deep breath. She slowly exhaled it. Then she looked towards Xavier and Beast as she pointed at Ezekiel as she said, in the boxes he gave us is a brand new top-of-the-line Stark Tech computer with two 30-inch monitors in one box, along with some other computer stuff. The other box was full of high-end camera equipment, some lights, microphones, and a bunch of other things. The computer alone is worth a lot of money, and the camera is probably worth even more money. It's a high-end digital film camera used to make movies. Ezekiel gave a shrug as he said, I had to make sure the website could handle 4K footage, so I had to buy all that stuff and test with it. I don't expect anyone to upload videos in 4K currently. It's way too expensive for normal people. But I wanted to future-proof the site now, so I didn't have to update a bunch of stuff later on. Now it's yours to use and make videos. Have fun. Before anyone else could speak, Logan opened the door and let Shui walk in, and he closed the door behind him as he entered himself. Shui smirked when he saw Kurt and Kitty again, but said nothing else. Logan looked at everyone in the room and asked, is everyone here going? Ezekiel smirked, then stood up and patted Kurt on the shoulder as he said, make sure you both read the instructions for everything before you use it. I look forward to seeing your first video. Kurt nodded his head in reply along with Kitty. As they did, Kurt reached over to Kitty and grabbed her hand. She started going intangible again as Kurt said, thank you again, Ezekiel. Bamf. Ezekiel smiled and glanced at Tao as he said, if you would please. Tao let out a sigh and made a portal. 00045. Trust isn't always a two-way street. Logan was standing in a room with Ezekiel, Tao, Fury, Tobarama, Orochimaru, Stryker, and some scientists they picked up at the facility they raided. The scientists, along with Stryker, were strapped down to a table and the latter was giving Logan a death glare. Logan had a small grin on his face. He might not currently remember the man, but after the way Stryker was cursing at him, he knew they had a history that wasn't pleasant. Ezekiel nodded towards Tobarama, who walked next to Stryker. He did some hand seals as he said, Kuchios, Edo Tensei, before he placed his hand on the seal on Stryker's forehead. The man started to struggle at first before he started to thrash around and scream into the ball gag in his mouth. Logan watched with horrid fascination as Stryker seemed to disintegrate into pieces of ash that floated to the floor and started to build up into something else. After a minute, he stopped making noise and went still. The pile of ash finished forming up and turned into Dr. Sutter. When he was fully complete, Tobirama placed a control seal in the back of his head. As he opened his eyes, Ezekiel said, "Mr. Sutter, you will only speak when asked a question, and you must fully answer that question to the best of your ability, unless told otherwise. If you understand, nod your head." As Sutter nodded yes, Logan asked, "What the hell did you just do?" Ezekiel glanced at Tobirama and said, "You can start the next one." As Tobirama started making hand seals, Ezekiel looked at Logan and said, "We used Stryker's soul to bring back Sutter. If we didn't place the control seal on him, it would be like he came back to life almost. With the control seal, he has no free will, and we can get answers from him we normally wouldn't be able to get." Logan grunted as he watched the scientist going through the same process and asked, "Who are you bringing back this time?" Ezekiel gave a Cheshire-like smile as he said, "Stryker." Logan snapped his head to look at Ezekiel as he asked, "Can I ask him about my past?" That was the plan. The people we bring back can stay together for about 48 hours before the spell fails and they disappear. We would also like to ask him some questions, but you can have him for the first 40 hours unless you finish with him sooner. Logan grunted as he nodded his head and turned back to watch the scientist going through the same process as Stryker. The process finished quickly and Logan was led to a room with the reanimated Stryker while Fury took Sutter to another room for interrogation. Ezekiel, Tobirama, Orochimaru, and Tao went to have an overdue conversation regarding souls, astral projection, and how it tied together with memories and a person's knowledge. Needless to say, their conversation ended up taking a few weeks. They took breaks, of course, since the clones only lasted about 25 hours and Tao needed to sleep, along with her other duties. But they spent at least 4 hours a day discussing the subject in depth, while Ezekiel was mostly just curious and wanted to know certain things, like how he still had all of his knowledge yet was just cells dividing in his mother's womb and didn't have a body, much less a brain. Tobirama and Orochimaru, on the other hand, wanted to talk in depth about everything related to souls, mostly for the upcoming project they were working on and also because they were knowledge junkies. Out of everyone currently in Theo's head, Tobirama and Orochimaru were the most dedicated to learning. The others would go for a few hours, then get bored or tired of what they were doing and do something else. Tobirama and Orochimaru would spawn as clones and then spend the entire time buried in books, researching obscure things on the internet or doing experiments. Half the time they worked on projects together and would be in perfect sync with each other without saying a single word. Theo wasn't sure if it was because they technically have the same memories or something else was going on, but it was pretty amazing to watch as they worked as a single-minded unit. A few days after Stryker and Sutter were questioned, Xavier contacted Ezekiel so they could meet. Xavier, along with Magneto and Beast, were transported by Kaecilius to the basement of the facility. On the left side of the basement area where some of the laboratories were, they were greeted by Ezekiel, Tobirama, Orochimaru, Kabuto, Sarah, Tsunade, Shizune, and Sakura. Xavier sent to Beast and Magneto, "Strange. Everyone here is like Ezekiel except for Dr. Kinney. I can sense her mind, but it's like it isn't there. The others I cannot sense at all, like they don't exist. I wonder if Ezekiel trained them all to block out telepaths." Beast sent back, "That is a possibility, Professor, since Dr. Kinney's mind is no longer open to you." Magneto, "Definitely something to consider, Charles." Xavier smiled as he said, "It's good to see you again, Ezekiel, Dr. Kinney." Xavier looked towards the other people gathered as he said, "It's nice to meet all of you. I am Charles Xavier. These are my friends, Dr. Henry McCoy and Max Eisenhart." Henry stepped forward. He was covered head to toe in a coat of fine blue fur. He was wearing a pair of square glasses that rested on the end of his snout, but behind the glasses you could see his yellow eyes and black vertical pupils. His pointed ears could just be made out behind his wild mane of blue hair. And as he smiled, his fang-like teeth became very noticeable, before he gestured to himself with his unusually large hands tipped with claws as he said, "You can just call me Hank if you like. Dr. McCoy also works." The first to greet him was a man with pale skin and snake-like, yellow eyes. He stepped forward with his right hand raised as he said, "It's a pleasure to meet you, Hank. You can call me Orochimaru. Your last paper on genetics was captivating, and I would love to discuss it in depth with you at some point." Tobirama stepped forward after Orochimaru, and as he shook Beast's hand, he said, "Tobirama Senju. I agree with Orochimaru. That paper is a work of genius. How did you figure out how?" Ezekiel clapped his hands as he said, "You guys can fanboy later. We have some work we need to do." Orochimaru glared at Ezekiel for a moment, but both him and Tobirama backed up and allowed the others to introduce themselves. As the others made introductions, Xavier noticed the youngest person in the group, the pink-haired girl who looked no older than 16. He had met many smart people in his time, and while he was sure the group before him was well-educated, he never heard any of their names before, let alone any mention of them anywhere in academic communities. After everyone was introduced, Xavier said, "I don't mean to be rude in asking this, but I have never heard of any of you by name before. Is there a reason for that?" Beast nodded his head in agreement. He had never heard of any of them before, and he had an eidetic-type memory. Ezekiel smiled as he said, "They aren't from around here, and let's leave it at that." Xavier sent a message to Beast and Magneto. "Not from Earth then, or something else? Different universe, maybe?" Magneto thought, "They seem human enough, but then again, other aliens seem human enough." Beast sent back, "If they are aliens, why do they want to help Earth? Or mutants, for that matter? With the visions Ezekiel gave Raven, I think they might be from a different universe. Possibly one that had one of those visions come true. Ezekiel and these people might be the survivors?" Xavier smiled as he said, "I understand. We might be working together, but we still have our own secrets." Ezekiel nodded as he said, "Exactly. One day we will bring you into our group completely, but we still have a lot of enemies and trust is a big issue for us. You obviously know the saying, 'Trust is earned, not given.' Magneto said it not long ago when you agreed to work with us." Xavier nodded his head as he said, "I have heard different versions of it a few times." Ezekiel's face lost its normal half-smirk as he said, "I personally think trust can never really be earned. It can only truly be given by someone who wants trust in return, which is why I asked both of you here today. I want you to give me your trust with something important." Xavier glanced at Magneto as he sent, "What do you think, old friend?" Magneto sent back, "I am not sure, but if he is asking for our trust, then it might be something he could easily take with his powers and instead wants us to trust him." "I was thinking something similar." Xavier looked back at Ezekiel as he said, "All right, what do you need?" Ezekiel smiled as he said, "Samples of your genetics." Both Xavier and Magneto shared a glance before they both focused on Ezekiel as Xavier asked, "Do you mind if I ask why?" "That is where your trust comes in. That being said, you can take as long as you like to come to a decision, but we could still use Hank's help with our other projects if you would like to join us." Magneto spoke right after as he said, "Fine. You can take some samples from me." Xavier looked over in shock as Magneto sent him. "If he gave us a hard time limit, I would have said no. But he said, take as long as we want. So either he doesn't really care about genetic samples from us." Xavier sent back, "Or he already has samples from us." "Exactly." Xavier looked back at Ezekiel as he said, "You can take samples from me also." Beast was a little surprised at Magneto and Xavier's response, but said nothing. Ezekiel smiled wide as he said, "I'm glad to hear you agree. I honestly didn't think you would so soon." Ezekiel turned to Sarah as he said, "Well, I'll leave everything in your capable hands. Tobirama and the others will help you from now on." Ezekiel looked at Xavier and his group as he said, "If you'll excuse me, I have some other things I need to take care of, but Dr. Kinney and the others can handle the rest." Xavier nodded in reply as Ezekiel looked at Kaecilius and said, "Port me back, and once you are done here, come find me, please." Kaecilius nodded his head as he made a portal. As Ezekiel was about to walk through it, he said, "Just so you know, I sent your school a shipment of the new Stark Tech computers. There should be enough that every student and faculty member will have one with about 30 spare computers in case you need more or some break." Xavier looked concerned, but Ezekiel was through the portal and it had already mostly closed when he went to speak. Xavier looked at Kaecilius, who just smirked slightly as he shrugged his shoulders. Beast said what the professor was wondering about. I hope he didn't ship them through normal means. Caecilius shook his head and said, we transfer everything through portals. The Ancient One should have delivered it to your underground hangar by now. VVVVVVVV. Ezekiel walked through the hallways of the base. He was currently headed to the last person he wanted to collect genetic samples from. Besides Xavier and Magneto, he had also collected samples from himself, Hank Pym, Bill Foster, Logan, Coulson, and Peggy. He also had collected samples from the base's cook. It took a bit to find a proper chef, but Peggy brought up Edwin Jarvis. The man was technically retired, and even though he still served the Starks, Tony was almost never home, and the man didn't have much to do most of the time. So he was ported into the base every day and would prepare food for breakfast, lunch, and dinner. He would also make some easily reheated meals for people who ate at odd hours. He also wanted to get samples from a few other people, but he knew asking Fury or Maria for samples wouldn't work. Fury was too paranoid still to trust Ezekiel, and Maria was already on the fast track being groomed as his replacement. It didn't take Ezekiel long before he located Steve. Honestly, he was never hard to find. The man only did 4 things currently. Spending time with Peggy was the main one, which if Steve wasn't careful, Peggy might need a hip replacement or worse sooner or later. Ezekiel noticed her walking with a slight limp more than once, and he doesn't think he is the only one to notice. Besides that, he was being caught up on everything he had missed while in stasis, which he usually did with Peggy and sometimes Coulson. Physical training was next, and last was spending time with the kids living in the base. He kinda became their unofficial PE coach, which he strangely excelled at. Ezekiel arrived at the base's indoor gym and stopped before the door. From outside the room, Ezekiel could hear the loud, solid thuds as Steve worked over a punching bag. Ezekiel grinned. He was glad he found Steve here and not with Peggy. Ezekiel opened the door as he walked inside. He took in the room. The gym was actually expanded by his clones not too long ago. Some of the Earth-type users made the room a little bigger than a football field in size, with a ceiling height of 30 feet. The whole thing was reinforced and compressed so much that it was stronger than modern-day concrete. The whole area was set up with a running track around the outside, with a full set of gym equipment set up on the first half of the field. Past the gym equipment was an area set up with mats and sparring equipment, along with all the training tools you would need to teach people how to fight. Ezekiel was by the door and over 60 yards from Steve, who noticed him almost immediately. Steve reached out and steadied the bag, before he reached down to pick up a towel and wipe down the light sheen of sweat coating his forehead. While he was doing that, Ezekiel seemed to flicker, and as the after image of Ezekiel faded out before the door, another Ezekiel appeared, standing a few feet from Steve. Steve smiled a little as he said, "It's hard, but I can still see you moving when you use that skill. That just means I haven't perfected it yet. The true peak of that skill is to make it seem like I teleported." Steve shook his head as he asked, "So did you come to practice, or did you finally come to ask me for some genetic samples?" Ezekiel let out a sigh as he said, "Peggy told you, didn't she?" "Of course she did. She said you wouldn't tell her why, though. I can understand asking me for some samples. I have the perfect super soldier formula inside me. Figuring out how it works could be useful, but you asked her, Coulson, Hank, and Bill for samples." Ezekiel nodded and said, "I also took samples from myself, Logan, Xavier, and Magneto. I have a few things I want to do, but the main one is running comparison tests with my genetics against everyone else. I want to see how different I am from normal humans." Steve was quiet for a few moments as he thought about it. He reached down, picked up his water bottle, and took a drink before he said, "You can take samples from me, but I don't want you to make another super soldier serum. The world doesn't need it. If you agree to that, you can have your samples." Ezekiel stuck his hand out and shook Steve's hand as he said, "You have yourself a deal." After they shook hands, Steve smiled and asked, "Care for a spar?" Ezekiel laughed as he said, "You know, if you punch me, I will disappear." "I know, that's why you need to dodge all of my attacks." 00046. Side Story 001. Hello, is this thing on? Kurt and Kitty were able to film a short few-minute video and upload it within a week of Ezekiel giving them their new equipment. It really should have been edited by Kitty, but she wasn't talking to Kurt currently, and all Kurt could really do is make a title card for it. So instead of just editing the video down and getting rid of part of it, he uploaded it all unedited. The video was titled Guten Tag and faded in from that title written in Comic Sans MS to a slightly messy bedroom covered in movie and band posters with no one in it. You could hear someone with an accented German voice ask, "Is it on?" A female voice replied, "Yes. It's recording your messy bedroom." "Oh." The other voice replied before a teenage boy covered with a fine blue-colored fur appeared on the screen. He had on some khaki cargo shorts and a t-shirt with the Highlander logo that read, "There can be only one." He has a curly mop of blue-tinted black hair on his head which is cropped slightly shorter on the sides and shows off his pointed ears. His eyes are a striking yellow color with no visible pupils, and as he smiled at the camera you could see his pronounced fang-like canine teeth on display. He raised his right hand to wave at the camera, and the viewer could see that his hand only had 3 digits, which included an opposable thumb. As he waved at the camera, a tail could be seen sometimes behind him as it waved back and forth in sync with his hand as the boy said, "Guten Tag. My name is Kurt Wagner, and as you can see I am a mutant." Kurt paused for a moment before he said, "Actually, I heard a new term recently and I think it sounds better than mutant. It was metahuman. I'm a metahuman." The boy put his arm down as he said, "I know a lot of people in the world misunderstand and fear metahumans. I think it's this misunderstanding and fear of metahumans that causes all of the hate we receive from people. So I wanted to show the world that while we may look different, we are just as human as you are. In fact, the only difference between us is a single gene in our DNA as far as I know." He rubbed the back of his head as he gave a sheepish smile and said, "Well, at least that's what I was told by someone a lot smarter than me." He still had his sheepish smile as he looked a little past the camera to somewhere behind it as he said, "This is a lot harder than I thought it would be, Kitty." A female voice could be heard as she said, "You think? That's why I said I didn't want to be on camera." Kurt's smile turned a little mischievous as he said, "Really?" The female's voice raised just a little as she said, "Don't you dare." Bamf! The boy disappeared in a cloud of smoke as another bamf was heard at almost the same time behind the camera somewhere. Bamf and another bamf was heard as the boy appeared again with a teenage girl next to him, with his tail wrapped around her waist. It all happened in less than a second. The girl was frozen like a deer in the headlights of a car as she looked at the camera. She was a few inches shorter than the boy and was wearing a Led Zeppelin band t-shirt and some faded jeans. Her brown hair was slightly curly and stopped at her shoulders. Her skin was pale white, like she doesn't go out much. Her hazel-colored eyes widened slightly as she looked at the camera, before she smacked the smiling Kurt in the back of the head. As he reached up to rub his head, the girl phased out of his tail and ran through the camera. Once she was behind the camera again, she could be heard saying, "Do that again and I will hide your swords for a whole week." Kurt's eyes went wide and his accent became heavier as he said, "Please don't hide my swords again. Then don't put me on camera." Kurt looked a little sad as he said, "Okay, no more kitty cam." His voice was barely above a whisper as he finished, "This time." "What did you say?" Kurt smiled as he said, "Nothing." Kurt looked back at the camera as he said, "So that was my best friend Kitty. We hang out a lot because we have the same classes. We also like a lot of the same movies." He pointed at his shirt before he waved at the posters behind him. He rubbed the back of his head again as he said, "To be honest, I didn't really think this video through very much, so I am not really sure what else to do or say." As he finished talking, someone could be heard yelling in a heavily accented Russian voice, "Kurt, you better not run away." Kurt looked to the door of his room as he said, "Looks like he didn't like my gift, and I made sure it was something he would cherish too." Kitty asked, "What do you mean? What did you do this time?" Kurt glanced back at Kitty, a smirk plastered on his face as he said, "You remember how we were talking about how he should improve his clothing selection and wear something other than his boring jeans and plain white t-shirts? You gave him some new clothes?" Kurt's smirk turned into a mischievous grin as he said, "Well, I did give him something, but..." The stomping of heavy feet could be heard getting closer as someone said, "You ruined my favorite shirt." Kurt looked shocked as he asked Kitty, "How can he know which one is his favorite shirt if they all look the same?" Kurt looked towards the door again as the footsteps were getting closer and said, "I gotta go, Kitty. You deal with him. He won't be as mad because he likes you. Don't bamf you dare." You could hear Kitty let out a sigh as the footsteps got louder before a surprised voice asked, "Kitty, what are you doing in Kurt's room?" Kitty turned the camera towards the door as she said, "We were filming a video, but Kurt took off when you said he ruined your favorite shirt." As the camera panned to the door, you could see more of Kurt's room. On the wall next to the open door was a rack hanging on the wall with a bunch of different swords resting in it. Standing in the doorway was a tall, very muscular teen whose frame almost took up the whole doorway. His short-cut black hair almost touched the top of the door frame as he stood inside it. He was wearing a pair of jeans and had a bright pink t-shirt on that looked like it was almost one size too small for him. He looked around the room for a moment with his ice blue eyes, before he waved his hand at the shirt he was wearing as he said, "Duh, look what he has done. All of my shirts look like this now." Kitty hummed before she said, "Honestly, it looks pretty good on you." The teen blushed a little as he asked, "You think so?" "Of course, Pyotr. I always thought you would look better if you changed up your wardrobe some and added some color to it." Kurt was thinking the same thing. He just took it a little too far. Pyotr lifted up his bald fist and his face went bright red as he said, "Duh. He put this in with my t-shirts when I put them in the washer." He opened his hand and resting in it was a pair of bright red lace panties. After a few seconds of silence, you could hear Kitty say, "Are those my Kurt?" The video ended abruptly after that. With the way Theo set up his platforms, everything was interlinked. So even if someone wanted to set up a fake account, it was always tied to a real person. Only he would be able to see who it really was on the back end of his servers. He wanted it like that. So while people could technically post anonymously if someone was a problem, they couldn't just hide who they really are, and Ezekiel could permanently ban them if needed. There were some workarounds for it if someone was crafty, but in the terms and conditions on sign up, it was strictly forbidden to use another person's info to sign up. It was also forbidden to use false info. Anyone who was caught would be banned for life. It was a lot of coding to do, but Theo had a program that figured out who was really behind the computer, setting up the account. If the person was not who they said they were, it wouldn't activate their account and send an error saying it couldn't process the information. If they didn't, it would keep sending error messages until they gave up or put in their real information. Since there was no real way to make fake accounts on any of his sites, it made moderating everything really simple. He didn't have to deal with fake accounts, spam bots, or any other real bullshit. He also had a program that took care of most of the day-to-day work, but he would still check stuff out each day. Sooner or later, he would have to hire some people to help him. Only because he was using 2 or 3 clones a day to do the work currently, and those clones could be used for other more important things. When Kurt made his account and uploaded his video, Theo's clone was the first person to watch it. He ended up laughing so hard at the end that he fell out of his chair. When he calmed down, he showed it to all of the other clones before he approved the video and uploaded it to the front page as recommended. It took off from there, and Kurt had over 500,000 views on the video and over 50,000 followers within a day of the video being uploaded. It actually made him the #1 most followed creator and would later on be considered the first viral video ever made. It might not seem like much, but the whole site overall was still small with a little over 3 million users which might log in once a week. Out of those users, only about 10% of them have uploaded at least one video. There were a few who have posted 10 or more videos and had a few thousand followers. But Kurt was the first real star of the platform, and the comment section of his video was just out of hand. "Great, Jake. This has to be staged." Oscar JJ. "That is some pretty cool editing. I wonder how they pulled it off." Kim K. "The second boy was a hunk. Is he single?" Alex F. "He kinda looked like a blue demon. His tail was awesome. I wish I had one." Greg H. "My man really stole her underwear. I bow to your recklessness." Kim K. Reply Greg H. "That was gross. Who would steal a girl's underwear?" Ben 10. Reply Greg H. Kim K. "A blue guy who can teleport apparently." Greg H. Reply Ben 10. LOL. Pretty much. Tim T. Comic Sans MS for the font really? Those were written in the first few minutes of the video going public, and it went on for thousands more. A good portion of people thought the video was staged. Some thought it wasn't. Some thought he was a metahuman. Some thought it was special effects. The main thing everyone agreed on was that the video was hilarious even if it was staged. Only one person didn't find the video funny, but it took them over a week to even find out about it. Kitty was still pissed off at Kurt, so she didn't watch the video after he uploaded it. When she was finally over it, she watched the video. It had been a week since Kurt and talked to Kitty. She was still pissed at him for putting her underwear in Pyotr's laundry. He was upset since his best friend wasn't talking to him, so he had uploaded the video and never checked it afterwards. He was currently laying on his bed reading his favorite book, The Three Musketeers, when he suddenly felt something was off, so he sat up and looked around. When he didn't find anything wrong, he went to lay back down. But right as he did, he heard Kitty yell, "Kurt!" Kurt dropped his book on his bed as he jumped out of it and landed on the ceiling of his room as he looked in the direction the yell came from. He wasn't sure what he did, but Kitty didn't sound happy. He was trying to think of what he might have done as she came running into the room through the wall. She looked absolutely livid as she looked up at him crouched on the ceiling. Kurt looked afraid as he said, "I didn't do anything, I swear." "You didn't do anything? You didn't do anything?" Kitty pointed at him as she yelled, "You uploaded that video?" Kurt tilted his head slightly as he said, Yeah, that Ezekiel guy said we had 2 weeks to upload it." "You didn't edit it." Kurt looked slightly ashamed as he said, "I didn't know how. You were supposed to do it for me." Over 1 million people have seen the video. Kurt actually fell off the ceiling in shock. His reflexes kicked in and he flipped over to land on his feet, but he was still in shock as he asked, "1 million people watched it?" She glared at him as she asked. Her voice was low and promised violence. "You didn't know that over 1 million people have seen my underwear because of you?" Kurt swallowed. His mouth was incredibly dry all of a sudden as he said, "Now that you mention it, no." Kitty reached back and grabbed one of Kurt's training swords off the wall. As she unsheathed it, Kurt said with concern, "Kitty, I don't really want to spar right now." "Good, I wasn't planning to spar." Kitty rushed forward as she said, "I am gonna beat some sense into you." Kurt teleported out of the way and to the door. Kitty turned around and said, "If you run, it will just be worse." Kurt opened the door and ran out of it as Kitty charged at him again. As he made it into the hallway, she just phased through the wall and was next to him within a moment. Before she could swing at him, he teleported down the hall a little to keep out of range. It was kinda normal to see Kitty chasing after Kurt for one reason or another, but Kurt yelling out, "I am sorry, I didn't think 1 million people would see your underwear," made everyone who heard it pause and try to figure out what he was talking about. It wasn't long before someone found the video he uploaded and told everyone else in the mansion about it. Needless to say, Kurt, Kitty, and Pyotr became more famous inside and outside the mansion after that event. 00047. 3 months in a flash. Theo was happy when he heard Peter's parents decided to quit their jobs to spend more time at home with Peter and the rest of their extended family. They announced it to everyone and the kids a week after the group trip to Coney Island. Theo had never seen Peter so happy, and he had spent Monday through Saturday with him for the past 3 years. Theo wanted to help out his family, so when Richard listed their condo in downtown Manhattan for sale, Theo was the one who bought it. He made a cash offer above list price for the condo through a real estate agent. He also paid the closing costs, and Richard was told they could stay in the condo as long as they needed if they paid rent, since the buyer was planning to use it as a rental property. But finding a new house didn't take that long. Theo had also made a pretty decent offer to the owners of a house on the same street as his parents' house. It was actually done before he bought Richard's condo. The people who owned the house took the offer and moved out within a week of closing the deal. Then Theo put the house up for sale, and Richard made an offer for it. The deal was closed quickly. Then Richard, Ben, and Jacob went through and remodeled a few things and painted everything with help from a contractor friend Ben knew. Richard, Mary, and Peter moved into the house after about a month, which was about 3 months after Ezekiel had collected samples from everyone. They then took all the spare money they had and spent that to renovate part of the basement and buy essential equipment they would need to work. It wasn't the cutting-edge stuff they had at their last job, but it was good enough to get started. They were planning to look for some grants and other things to help supplement what was missing. Moving away from Theo's family, the new base they had was up and running. It even had a spell ward set up like the other base, so there was only one place to portal into it. Beast, who joined the research team, would at first only spend a few hours a week working with them. But he quickly came to respect and realize how smart all of them were. He ended up changing his personal schedule and now spends at least 4 hours a day during the week working in the lab with them. and on the weekends he will spend 10 hours or more. He also became pretty fast friends with Orochimaru and Tobirama. During that time, Orochimaru and the others had made a lot of progress on their work. Their first goal was to completely sequence the genetic samples they were given by everyone. But with the equipment they had, it wasn't that hard to do. The only issue was the samples from Theo himself. They took over 2 weeks to finish, and both Beast and Sarah were stunned at the complexity of the completed genome. Orochimaru, Kabuto, and Tobirama were the opposite. When they saw how simple the genomes they collected from the others were, they honestly thought something wasn't right with the equipment and wanted to double-check everything the old-fashioned way. They made it through Coulson's complete genome in only a few days and just couldn't believe the difference in genomes between this world and where they came from. The funniest thing about the whole situation was Orochimaru's attitude. At first, he was delighted to see what made humans turn into metahumans. But once he realized how simple their complete genome was, he lost almost all of his interest in metahumans. In his words, it was like trying to compare a masterpiece of art to some stick figures your kid made. The bright side to the whole thing was that Orochimaru and the others had little issues figuring out how the X gene worked and how to modify it. It still needed a lot of testing before they were done, but their main goal was to make it where any metahuman could turn off their own powers. It wasn't a cure, but for the people who didn't like the side effects of their powers, they would now have an opportunity to live normally when they were switched off. Beast was really excited about this research and was helping to spearhead it. A different project that was being run by Tsunade, Shizune, and Sakura was trying to create a new type of medicine. It would basically heal anything wrong with you and could regrow limbs. They were using the samples taken from Logan and samples the facility had from Laura. It was slow going since they were trying to take the healing effects from their mutations and turn it into some type of retrovirus. The last project was about cloning. Both Sarah and Orochimaru had their own cloning project. Orochimaru was focused on a cloning project using Theo's genome, while Sarah was trying to figure out how to splice Steve's modified super soldier gnome with other people's. She was actually making very fast breakthroughs, and it wasn't that hard, considering people had been trying to replicate the serum itself for years without proper success. Over that same 3-month period, Sarah, Laura, and Cecily had integrated into the base rather quickly. They were each given rooms, and Ezekiel gave them free rein on the budget to get anything they wanted to make the room livable. Sarah's room was relatively plain, a small bookcase, desk with a computer, and some other essential things, as well as a few pictures with her and Laura. She even had a picture of her, with her sister, Laura, and her niece when they left the base to visit them for a few days. Cecily's room was pretty typical for a teenage girl. She had asked for a bunch of clothes, band posters, stereo, computer, TV. She also had pictures of her with her parents. Most of them were from before she had powers, but a few were from afterwards. Cecily was lucky because the facility hadn't disposed of her family's stuff yet. She mostly took all the pictures her family had, along with a few other things of sentimental value. Laura was the biggest surprise when it came to what she asked for. Well, maybe it wasn't, since Laura was currently only 13, but she had asked, with encouragement from Sarah, for a large amount of stuffed animals. Her king-size bed was literally half covered in the things. She also asked for a bookshelf filled with books. She had asked for anything that is fun to read. So Ezekiel and Sarah picked out a bunch of classic books like Three Musketeers, 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, Treasure Island, and The Mark of Zorro, to name a few. Laura liked to spend a few hours each day just reading in her bed, snuggled between her stuffed animals. As for integrating with other people, Cecily made friends with the other kids rather quickly. Laura, on the other hand, was still having issues. Possibly as a way to help herself cope with the recent loss of her parents, Cecily had taken on the role and acted as an older sister to Laura. It was helping a lot to bring Laura out of her shell. Laura has even started interacting more often with the other kids, without the need for one of them to initiate the interaction first. Speaking of the kids, they actually had a pretty good routine set up. They would have some type of structured classes a few hours a day, along with their kitchen duty. Jarvis had all of the kids helping in the kitchen. They would all help to prepare and serve food. Afterwards, the kids would clean up everything. A few of the kids he was also teaching how to properly cook. The schooling for the kids was a lot more relaxed since there were only a handful of kids, and they all ranged widely in age. But for at least 3 hours each weekday, they would have a tutor/teacher. Their teachers were a rotation of Hank, Bill, Steve, Peggy, Jarvis, Sarah, Carlson, and Eric Koenig. Jarvis and Steve were the only ones to see the kids almost every day, though, since one they helped out in the kitchen and the other trained them in physical fitness. Each one of them had their own specific courses and needed to do a certain amount of coursework each week to be considered passing. But honestly, it was a lot better than normal school, and all of them would normally complete their weekly assignments by Monday or Tuesday at the latest. They would spend the rest of the week either hanging out together in the rec room or doing their own thing when not helping out in the kitchen. The rec room was another area that Ezekiel had made, much to the annoyance of Fury. It was placed close to the theater room Ezekiel had made and was designed for recreation and relaxation. But it was still a work in progress. The main areas were complete. The first area had pool tables, air hockey, foosball, shuffleboard, and ping-pong tables, as well as a bunch of arcades, pinball machines along with some TVs set up to some gaming consoles and beanbag chairs. Another section was called the library. It was actually soundproofed, so it was always quiet inside, and it was filled with books on anything you could think of and was sorted like a normal library. The library was actually one of the first things that was completed, since Ezekiel had all of those school books, but they also purchased a bunch of other books for it. The room was completed with a bunch of comfortable chairs, couches, and beanbag chairs that people could use to read in. The only other completed section was the swimming pool. It had a sauna as well as a couple jacuzzis and some tubs for ice baths. Ezekiel was still in the process of having a bowling alley installed. The process was taking a while because they technically had to do everything themselves. They couldn't just hire someone to come build this stuff for them. Ezekiel ended up using his clones to do all the work. Some of it was easy, like the pool was mostly made using earth jutsu. Then they just needed to plaster it, as well as run all of the infrastructure for it. The bowling alley, on the other hand, needed to be built a certain way. So some of his clones were researching how to build it properly. Another thing that was planned, but was to be built in the gym area, was a giant climbing wall. That was going to be made using earth jutsu, but currently it wasn't a priority like the bowling alley was. As for what was happening in the outside world, after Magneto's speech to the world 3 months ago, it seems like overall it was about the same as before, while some people came out to support metahumans a little more. Just as many people came out against metahumans and were very vocal about it. One of the things the anti-metahuman people would do is target anyone who was vocal about being pro-metahuman. So anyone who was pro-metahuman would only post online anonymously for fear of being targeted. Ezekiel with his program was doing what he could to help, but he only removed stuff when people threatened violence on other people or metahumans. While he could have done a lot more, he knew there would be even more negative backlash towards metahumans if he just completely removed or stopped all of the people posting metahuman hate stuff. He did go out of his way to shut down some of the more zealous/rabid metahuman haters. He would target them and completely ruin their computers. If they got a new one, or used a friend's computer to post their hate-filled propaganda, those would be ruined also. Hopefully those people would get the point and stop with their hate-filled bullshit before Ezekiel decided to really go after them and ruin not just their computers, but also their lives. But on a positive note, the video Kurt had uploaded had almost 2 million views. Kitty wanted him to take it down at first, but Kurt argued it was showing a lot of people that metahumans were just as normal as they were. So Kitty finally relented and allowed him to keep the video up. But that wasn't all. Kitty and Kurt had uploaded a few more videos to the channel. They were pretty much prank videos, and each one so far was a hit with a few 100,000 views each. One very positive note that happened was that Hydra had taken the bait Ezekiel. The encrypted phone software Ezekiel designed for S.H.I.E.L.D. was finally put into use by Hydra. While it looked like they had some people go over it and change a few things about it, the overall encryption wasn't touched. So Ezekiel was already building a list of Hydra agents. The only downside was it was taking a while to spread it out to everyone in Hydra, but certain key people in S.H.I.E.L.D. were already using it. People like Alexander Pierce, John Garrett, and an up-and-coming agent Jasper Sitwell. Hopefully, it would spread to the members outside of S.H.I.E.L.D. and Ezekiel would finally be able to find where Vasily Karpov was at along with Bucky. While Ezekiel had spent a lot of time trying to find Vasily Karpov and the base he was stationed at, it seemed like the Soviet Union had no records of it on any of their secure servers. There were probably paper records of it, but Ezekiel didn't have access to that. He did try to bribe a few people to find it for him. He was never specific in what he wanted, but just asked for any files pertaining to secret facilities built during the Soviet Union era. He had to hand it to the new government. They were amazing at finding anyone selling secrets. Everyone Ezekiel found and hired were caught before they could send him any information. So he gave up after his third attempt. 00048. New person in the base. Hank had taken Ezekiel's advice, and after meeting Darren Cross, he offered him a special job that wasn't working for PIM Technologies. Darren at first seemed a little disappointed, but still said yes to the offer because Hank was an idol to him. But then Darren was tested. It was something Fury, Peggy, and Hank had come up with to screen potential members. The process was extremely thorough, and once completed, Darren was actually excited to join whatever the project was. He still needed to be vetted. Ezekiel did part of it, and went through pretty much any digital trance of Darren's life and pulled it apart. He went through school records and anything else he could get his hands on. While that was going on, a few other people were talking to everyone Darren knew: teachers, friends, classmates, parents, the guy who owned a deli next to campus he liked to eat at. When they were satisfied with everything, a giant report was submitted to the person doing the psych exam. While the psych exam was harsh and asked very uncomfortable questions, Darren still passed the psych eval with flying colors. So even though Fury didn't want to allow a possible future villain to join the group, he was outvoted by Ezekiel, Tao, Hank, Bill, Peggy, and Steve. Steve had actually said, "I see no reason we can't give the man a chance." Ezekiel said he looks up to and idolizes Hank, and at some point thought of him as a father figure. The only reason he would turn into a villain is because of how Hank would treat him. Steve smiled towards Hank as he said, "If you don't treat him terribly, I see no reason for him to have any type of change in behavior going forward." Ezekiel nodded his head before he said, "Honestly, I think he will end up being a great asset to us. I do think we should implement psych evals for everyone going forward though, and have a checkup every 3 months, just to make sure everything is fine. What does everyone else think?" Everyone voted for that motion to pass. VVVVVVV. Ezekiel walked through the base towards the area Hank used for his laboratory. He had used clones to make the area bigger for the quantum tunnel he was making with the help of Bill and a recent addition to the base. Ezekiel still hadn't met the man. He was busy with his own projects. But he heard the man was apparently floored when he met Steve. Being dead yet still alive, and looking like you haven't aged a day in 60 years has that effect on people. Ezekiel made it to the room and walked through the open double door. It only took him a moment to find Hank, Bill, and Darren in front of a computer that was seated on the observation deck. Ezekiel walked towards them, and as he got closer, he heard Darren as he said, "I've run the model 4 times now. It's stable." Hank shook his head as he said, "It's honestly amazing. I can't believe you came up with a working model in such a short time. But I still don't see how you were able to do it. It's so close to my model, yet your model is stable. What did you change?" Darren beamed as he said, "I changed out some of the component metals with a vibranium composite mix. I had the idea to use vibranium after meeting Steve." "His shield gave you the idea?" Darren nodded his head as he enlarged the model a little and selected all of the components that he changed out. Bill spoke next as he said, "Honestly, it's not a bad idea. But where are we going to find what looks like 60 pounds of vibranium?" Darren looked back at Bill and smiled as he said, "It's actually only about 20 pounds. All of those are hybrid metals." Hank nodded his head as he said, "That does sound a lot more reasonable, but I think that's pretty much all the vibranium the world currently has. I don't know if we could even get it all. That doesn't include asking Steve if we can melt down his shield." Hank looked at Darren as he said, "Could you make some changes to use less vibranium, or maybe some other type of hybrid metal?" Everyone was so absorbed in their conversion that they hadn't noticed Ezekiel until he said, "I heard you were in the market for some vibranium. I might know where to get some." Hank was the first to react and turned around. He had a smile on his face as he asked, "You never knock, do you?" "Not when you leave the door open. Plus, you nerds wouldn't have heard me knocking." Bill reached out and shook Ezekiel's hand as he said, "Takes one to know one." Ezekiel smiled back as he asked, "Really? I'd expect something more witty from you." Bill had a sheepish smile as he said, "Sorry, I've been surrounded by Mary and Ava half the time. I think their childish behavior has been rubbing off on me." Ezekiel patted Bill's shoulder as he nodded and said, "That's a good thing. It will keep you young." Hank pointed to Darren, who had stood up, and said, I don't think you two have met. Darren Cross, I would like you to meet Ezekiel. Darren reached forward to shake Ezekiel's hand as he said, It's nice to meet you. Hank said you are the one who is funding everything. Ezekiel smiled back as they released hands and said, I do a lot more than just give everyone money. I also find things. Things like vibranium. I overheard you are in need of some? Hank replied as he shook his head. We would need at least 20 pounds of the stuff. That might be all of it that's on the earth. Ezekiel had a smirk as he said, That isn't even close to what we have. It might take me a few days, but I can get you at least 50 pounds of the stuff. Hank was about to speak when Ezekiel frowned as he said, Actually, I would have to ask someone if I can have it. It's technically his. Darren looked surprised as he asked, You know someone who has 50 pounds of vibranium? Ezekiel nodded his head as he said, More than that, actually. I don't know the exact amount, but if sold it would net them at least a few $1 billion. Probably. But then some annoying people would show up that I don't want to deal with. Everyone looked a little confused at Ezekiel's statement, but he just waved them off as he said, It's fine. Nothing you guys need to worry about. So where are you at in building the quantum tunnel? Hank smiled and said, Well, we have the test model I made working with Darren's modifications and testing simulations. Everything seems completely stable. Ezekiel smiled wide at that as he said, That's great news. Make sure you triple-check the simulations under stress tests. I don't want this thing to blow up in the base. I know you mad science types have a history of blowing shit up. Actually, now that I think about it, talk with Tao. She might be able to stop you from blowing up the base. Hank's eyes lit up as he asked, The mirror dimension? Darren asked, Who is Tao and what is the mirror dimension? Ezekiel looked at Hank as he asked, He hasn't met Tao yet? Hank shook his head as he said, No, she has been busy the past week. Really? Doesn't she teach Ava almost every day? Hank shrugged his shoulders as he said, I didn't want to destroy his worldview within a week of starting. Destroy my worldview? The mirror dimension? What are you two even talking about? Ezekiel laughed as he said, You will see soon enough. Darren was about to ask another question when Ezekiel interrupted him as he said, I need to go talk with someone about that vibranium. It was nice meeting you. As Darren said, It was nice? Ezekiel's after image faded away. Darren had a shocked look before he turned to Hank and asked, He's a mutant? Hank shook his head and said, No, he is a metahuman, but it doesn't matter. You will get used to it. Darren frowned as he asked, Him being a metahuman? Or him leaving while you were talking? Hank laughed as he patted Darren's shoulder and said, Both. Maybe. He is a pretty decent guy once you get to know him and his idiosyncrasies. Actually, Tao is kind of the same way. Hank shook his head and then pointed at the computer as he said, I want you to run the simulation again, but this time let's try to have it fail. Make the power of the tunnel about 5% more powerful, and we will keep testing it till failure. Then I want to modify the model using more vibranium and test it again with the same setting till failure. Bill glanced at Hank as he asked, You think Ezekiel will get us more than 20 pounds of vibranium? I think it will be more than that, but let's run tests till we have a stable model using 50 pounds. VVVVV. Ezekiel frowned to himself as he walked to the gym. He had been putting off this talk for a while, but if Hank needed vibranium, there were only 4 real options to get it. The first option was to find it in space. That would take too long. Next would be to deal with Namor, and he didn't want to mess with him currently. Wakanda would be the best choice, but that would still be a giant mess he didn't want to deal with. The last choice was taking the stolen vibranium Ulysses Clow has. Ezekiel found 2 issues with that, though. The first was while Ulysses did steal the vibranium from Wakanda, he stole it from Jobu. At least that is what Ezekiel thought about the matter. So since that vibranium was from Jobu, it means it should now belong to his son. If he wanted to use the vibranium, he would need to talk with Eric, something he has been putting off since he was brought here. Ezekiel stopped at the gym door for a moment, as he reverted to his normal carefree smirk and walked into the gym. Inside, he could see Steve and the kids as they ran around the track. Ezekiel took his time as he walked over to where some towels and water bottles were and waited for them to finish up their run. Everyone noticed him pretty quickly, but everyone stayed focused while they finished running 2 more laps before finally starting to slow down and walk the last half of the track. Ezekiel greeted everyone with a smile as he asked, How was the run? Mary was sprawled out on the ground as she said, It was terrible. I hate running. Ava was laying next to Mary and just nodded her head in agreement. Grant, Hope, Eric, Cecily, and Laura didn't seem to have an opinion on the matter as they were resting on some of the benches next to the track. Steve looked like he hadn't been running at all as he walked close to Ezekiel and said, "It's a little unexpected to see you here. Did something come up?" Ezekiel nodded his head as he said, "Nothing important. I actually came to find Eric. I wanted to chat with him about something." Eric perked up at hearing his name and looked over, but didn't say anything as Steve said, "Eric? We are almost done," but he could sit out the rest of the workout. Ezekiel shook his head as he said, "It's not a rush. He can finish his workout with you, clean up, and then come see me in my work area afterwards." Steve glanced over to Eric, who was looking at him, and Ezekiel. He smiled and asked, "You catch all of that?" Eric nodded his head as he said, "Yes, sir." Steve nodded, then looked back at Ezekiel. Then he let out a sigh as he caught sight of Ezekiel already nearing one of the doors for the gym. He turned back around, and he could see most of the kids smiling at him. Steve gave them a playful glare as he asked, "You think that was funny?" All the kids nodded back, and Steve let out a little chuckle as he said, "It might have been for you, but it was kinda rude." "All right, that was enough rest. It's time to do burpees." All the kids let out a groan, but started to get up. Vivi. Eric walked to the door to Ezekiel's work area and knocked on the door. After a few moments, a young man with black hair opened the door. Eric had seen him a few times, but only ever with Ezekiel. From what he understood, he was somehow related to Ezekiel. Apparently, there were a lot of people that were related to Ezekiel who were at the base, but he wasn't sure how, since most of them looked nothing alike. The man smiled and stepped back out of the way as he pointed to one side of the room as he said, "Ezekiel said you would be stopping by. He is over there waiting for you." "Thank you, sir." The man shook his head as he said, "Don't call me sir. You are making me feel old. You know I am only like a year older than you, right? Just call me Shursway." Eric took another look at the young man in front of him before he said, "Sorry, it's a habit. I just assumed you were older since you weren't with me and the other kids." Shursway smiled as he said, "Don't worry about it, Eric." Eric nodded in return as he said, "It's nice to meet you, Shursway." "Same to you." Shursway stepped out of the way as he said, "I won't hold you up any longer." Eric nodded his head in reply as he walked past Shursway and went to the desk Ezekiel was sitting at. When he reached it, he said, "You wanted to speak with me, sir?" Ezekiel smiled as he looked up and said, "You don't have to use sir with me. Honestly, I think Steve is the only one who really appreciates it properly. Just call me Ezekiel." Eric looked a little unsure as he asked, "Are you sure?" Ezekiel nodded as he said, "Completely. Now sit down and let's have a long overdue talk." 00049. A long overdue talk. Eric was seated in a chair in front of Ezekiel's desk as Ezekiel asked, "Do you know why I wanted to talk to you?" Eric shook his head as he said, "No, not really." Ezekiel gave a smirk as he said, "Come on, Eric. A smart kid like you. You should have some idea why I wanted to talk to you." Eric studied Ezekiel for a few moments before he said, "My SAT scores on the mock test?" Ezekiel nodded his head as he said, "It was one of the reasons. But since you brought it up, let's start with your mock SAT test scores. You scored an almost perfect 1600. Most colleges that you apply to will consider your application just on that alone. Have you thought about where you want to go?" Eric thought for a few moments before he said, "MIT, but I doubt they would want someone like me." "Why would you say that? You are 15 and incredibly smart. I would think most colleges would love to have you as a student." Eric gave a self-deprecating smile, and there was a slight, hidden edge to his voice as he said, "A young black kid from the ghetto with a GED? Maybe if I was in high school taking honors classes still. But now?" Ezekiel frowned a little before he asked, "You know, I never thought of that. Are you upset you were pulled out of school and brought here?" Eric just stared back at Ezekiel with a slight glare. Ezekiel let out a sigh and then said, "I will take that as a yes. Guess I really messed up your plans. You were already aiming for early graduation and getting into MIT?" Eric nodded his head in reply, but just kept his slight glare on Ezekiel. Ezekiel smiled as he said, "You know that is still on the table for you, if you want to take that path. But maybe I could offer you a different path, a better path." Eric seemed to perk up a little, but still had a slight frown as he asked, "Like what?" "Well, that is part of the reason I wanted to talk with you today. Do you know why you are here?" Eric paused at that question for a fraction of a second before he said, "Because you wanted to talk to me?" Ezekiel shook his head and said, "I like the way you dodged the real question, so let me rephrase it better. Do you have any idea why you were found and brought to this secret base?" Eric went slightly on guard as he said, "No, not really. I was just an orphan kid living in Oakland before I was brought here." Ezekiel smirked as he said, "I know Fury is the only person who really looked into your background and didn't find anything. Yet he still found you and brought you here. Do you know why?" Eric's eyes narrowed the slightest bit as he said, "No, not really. Because I told him you were important." Eric's hands clenched just the tiniest bit as he asked, "Why?" "I am just some no-name black kid." Ezekiel laughed as he said, "Eric, or would you prefer I call you Njadaka?" Eric sat forward. He glowered at Ezekiel and his body was tense as he asked with an angry tone of voice, "Who told you that name?" "No one from your father's homeland, if that's what you were wondering." Eric was still tense and his voice still had that angry edge to it as he asked, "Then how come you know that name and why wait all this time to bring it up now?" "I've been here for a year." "Why now?" Ezekiel let out a long tired sigh as he waved towards Eric as he said, "Relax, this is gonna take a while." Eric sat back in his chair a little, but his body was still tense. Ezekiel shot him a glare as he said, "I said to relax, kid. I won't tell you anything until you do." Eric sat there, staring at Ezekiel for a few moments before he took a deep breath and slowly let it out as the tension left his body. When he was done, he looked like he normally did. But Ezekiel could still hear the tinge of anger in his voice as he asked, "Happy?" Ezekiel returned a slight frown as he said, "Yes. Your first question might be the easiest to tell you, but the hardest one to believe. I have seen the past and the future. That is how I know your name, and at the same time know what you were planning to do. You have a good heart, kid, but your ideals are twisted, just like your father's were." Eric bolted out of his chair. A finger pointed in Ezekiel's face as he yelled, "You don't know anything about me and my father's ideals. What would someone like you know about my people's struggles?" Ezekiel laughed for a few moments before he asked in a mocking tone, "Why? Because I am not black?" Eric glared back at Ezekiel as he said, "Exactly. You can't understand because you aren't one of us." Ezekiel shook his head as he said, "Just because my skin is a different color doesn't mean I can't understand other people's struggles and hardships. I get it. You witnessed a lot of oppression towards people of African and African American descent. Your father also did, and it made him want to change the status quo. But he went about it the wrong way, and you want to go down that same path. I will tell you right now, that path only leads to your death." Eric didn't lose his glare, and the anger in his voice was palpable as he yelled, "So I am gonna die with some panther claws in my chest too?" Ezekiel shook his head as he said, "No, you die next to your cousin as you watch the sunset in Wakanda. Gotta admit, it was a pretty boss way to go. You pulled a spear out of your chest when he was offering to heal you. I wasn't completely sure before when you said you saw the future, but now I know you were full of shit. I would never kill myself. Now tell me how you really found out about me." Ezekiel gave a smirk as he asked, "Not a believer? Want me to prove it?" Eric relaxed a little as he sat back down. His voice still had some heat in it as he said, "You can try, but no matter what you say, it will just be more bullshit." Ezekiel smirked as he said, "Have a fun trip." "What AR?" Eric's face went a little slack and his eyes were glazed over. Ezekiel looked at the monitor on his desk as he said, "Now let's see about finding where Ulysses is hiding." The next hour or so passed pretty quickly as Ezekiel worked on his computer. He finally looked up when he heard a confused Eric ask, "What just happened?" Eric's face had drained of color. His eyes were wide and his hands were touching his chest as he looked at it. Ezekiel looked back at his computer as he said, "Proof." Over a minute passed before Eric asked. His voice was low, "What was that really?" "It was like I was in a dream." Ezekiel glanced at Eric, who was now looking at him. So he turned his full attention back to Eric as he said, "That wasn't a dream. That is your future if you stay on your current path. Tell me, what did you feel while you were there?" Eric was quiet for a few moments with his eyes closed as he thought back to what he just experienced. When he finally opened his eyes, he said, Anger. So much anger. He was ruthless and didn't care about anything except his goal. It was the only thing that mattered. Linda. She loved him and I killed her. Because she was in the way of my goal. I liked her, but I didn't hesitate to kill her. Ezekiel nodded his head as he said, that anger needs to be dealt with. Anger leads to hate. Hate leads to suffering. Suffering leads to anger in another person, and then the cycle repeats. Eric looked a little confused as he asked, is that some kind of Buddhist quote or something? Ezekiel shook his head as he said, something like that. So do you want to try the path you already saw the end of? Or would you like to try a different path? The different path, is that really even a question? Ezekiel smiled as he said, well, we need to deal with your anger first. Therapy would be the best way, but that takes time. Or we can also do a deep dive into your head and find the root cause. But instead of years, it would only take a few hours. Eric took a few moments before he said, let's do the second one. Ezekiel looked at the time before he said, I need to prepare something first. How about you come here first thing after breakfast? I will inform your teacher and Steve that you will be with me most of the day tomorrow. Eric nodded his head. He was still in a slight daze as he asked, so what else did you want to discuss with me? Ezekiel smiled as he said, nothing that can't wait till tomorrow. The conversation will be better when you have a clearer head. Eric seemed almost normal again, but Ezekiel could notice it better now. Even though Eric was thinking over what he had just seen, that hidden anger was just below the surface. Eric gave another nod before he stood up and left. Shursway made his way over and asked, that didn't seem to go as planned. Ezekiel shook his head as he said, I shouldn't have put it off for so long, but he seemed like such a normal kid. I know I didn't interact with him that much, but when I did he never showed any issues. Heck, Steve sees him every day and never noticed his anger issue. The kid is great at hiding it, but his father is his soft spot. Shursway gave it some thought before he said, so what is the plan? I will have Inoichi work with him tomorrow and help him get to the root of his problem. Target his father's death and probably his mother's death also. Once that is done, we can move forward with something else I have been putting off. Ezekiel reached out and spun his monitor around to show Shursway the screen. It was a satellite view of a boat that was currently landlocked. It had a few people with guns on it patrolling on and around it. The view changed and it showed a picture of a man who had short-cut gray and white hair with a neatly trimmed beard. Shursway looked over to Ezekiel as he asked, finally going after Clow? Do we need vibranium for something? Ezekiel nodded his head and said, Darren figured out a way to make Hank's tunnel work, but he needs vibranium to do it. Plus, we should figure out if we can use it for chakra metal. VVVVV. Eric showed up to Ezekiel's work area after breakfast and found that Shursway and everyone else he saw yesterday were missing. Ezekiel greeted him after he knocked on the door and walked him over to one of the couches in the room as he said, just wait here for a little bit. Everyone will be here soon. Eric was about to speak when Ezekiel disappeared into a puff of smoke. Eric wasn't that surprised. He had seen Ezekiel do a lot of weird things since he had been staying in the base. He decided to just sit back and wait. He didn't have to wait long. Within 10 minutes, people started walking in the door. It only took a few moments before he saw Shursway and Ezekiel walk in. He had seen more than double the amount of people here yesterday. Currently, there were only 5 people who were with Ezekiel. Ezekiel and Shursway were at the back of the group, talking to a man with blonde hair and a girl that looked like she could be his daughter. Eric stood up from the couch as they got close. Ezekiel smiled as he pointed to the man and teenage girl as he said, this is Inoichi Yamanaka and his daughter Ino Yamanaka. Inoichi, Ino, this is Eric Stevens. Eric reached out to shake Inoichi's hand as he said, it's nice to meet you, sir. As they shook hands, Inoichi smiled and said, it's always nice to meet a young man with manners. You know my daughter is single and just turned 16. Ino blushed slightly before she stomped on her dad's foot as she said, hello, I'm Ino. Eric shook Ino's hand for a moment before Ezekiel said, all right, introductions are out of the way, so I will leave you guys alone to help Eric out. As Ezekiel walked towards his desk with Shursway, Inoichi said, this will be easier if you lay down on that couch behind you. He glanced at his daughter and asked, could you grab us some chairs? As Eric laid down on the couch, Ino walked off to grab some chairs for her father and her to use. When she came back, her father had her set both chairs next to where Eric's head was and said, All right, Eric. Ino is going to be the one to help you out. I am just here to make sure nothing goes wrong. Eric looked a little concerned as he asked, I thought this was like therapy, but quicker? Ino was already going through hand signs as Anoichi smiled at Eric as he said, You think you can take shortcuts and it will be easy? There are always risks. Before Eric could reply, Ino placed her hands on his head and he went limp on the couch. Anoichi chuckled to himself as he stood up to go read a book. He had to admit, Ezekiel might be onto something when it comes to messing with people. 00050. A new path forward. It was a little past lunchtime when Eric and Ino finally came out of Eric's Mindscape therapy session. Ezekiel noticed, and so did everyone else, because Eric gave Ino a big hug after he stood up, and it made Ino yelp and turn bright red. Everyone could hear Anoichi's loud laugh from the other side of the room, which only made Ino turn a darker shade of red. After Eric let go, Ino turned around and walked over towards her father, who was still laughing. Eric, on the other hand, made his way to Ezekiel's desk with a slight grin on his face. Ezekiel was seated at his desk, working on his computer. Seated close to the desk was Shursui, who was currently reading a book. Once Eric was close to the desk, Ezekiel said, It's just past lunchtime. Do you want to go eat? Eric sat down as he said, I'm not hungry. Ezekiel nodded as he said, How do you feel? Eric was quiet for a moment before he said, Lighter. Like a weight I never knew I was carrying is gone. I am glad we were able to help you. Eric glanced over at Ino, who was talking with her father, as he said, You said you wanted to show me a new path. What is it? It's whatever you want it to be, except now your judgment isn't clouded anymore. Eric sat back as he relaxed in the chair for a little while. He would glance towards Ino sometimes as he thought. Ezekiel quietly waited for him. A few minutes passed before Eric said, Even though my anger is gone, I still want to help my people. That is a noble goal to aim for, but why not help everyone instead of just one group? Eric was quick to reply as he asked, Who else is dealing with hardships brought on by a system built to keep them down? Ezekiel nodded his head as he said, I won't argue with you there, but that is mostly in the United States. What about the rest of the world? It was over a minute before Eric said, I'm not even sure how to fix what is wrong here. How am I going to help the rest of the world? Ezekiel smiled at that as he said, With friends and allies. Did you see the broadcast a few months ago? After Eric nodded his head, Ezekiel said, That facility Magneto talked about, that was a joint mission. We worked together with his people to take that place down. Have you talked with Cecily or Laura much? Eric shook his head as he said, Laura only really replies with single words most of the time or a grunt. Cecily talks a lot more than Laura, but she hasn't talked much about where she came from. They came from that place? Ezekiel nodded his head as he said, Yes, but it's not my place to tell you their stories. If you really want to know it, just be a good friend to them, and one day they might tell you. Ezekiel shook his head as he said, Sorry, got a little off track. My point was we are already working to change the world for the better with our allies. Not just for one group of people, but for everyone. Are you saying if I want to accomplish my goals, I need to join you? Ezekiel shrugged as he said, Not really. If you want to go off and do your own thing, I won't stop you. I will even help you as long as it doesn't interfere with my plans. Eric studied Ezekiel for a while before he asked, Even if my plans involve killing a king? If you feel that is the only path forward for you, I won't stop you. But I also won't help you with that either. Are you really sure that is the best idea, though? Eric nodded his head as he said, He killed my father. That needs to be answered for. If you kill him, you'll never be able to connect with what's left of your family. Eric had a little bit of heat in his voice as he asked, So I just let my father's murder go free? Ezekiel shook his head as he said, No, I just said not to kill him. You might be able to ruin his reputation, though, and have him removed from being king. You might even be able to fight for the crown at that point if you wanted. Eric shook his head as he said, I don't care about being king. I just want some justice for my father. Ezekiel laughed as he said, You do know your father betrayed Wakanda and tried to kill one of its citizens in front of its king. I am pretty sure you could argue his killing was justifiable. What you really want is vengeance. Which is honestly fine with me. I just don't want you to kill him. Eric frowned a little as he said, So I can't kill him, but you are fine with me getting some type of revenge, even though you think my father being killed was justified? How does that make sense?" Ezekiel grinned as he said, "It doesn't need to make sense. What matters is if you want help or not." Ezekiel waited for Eric to think it over. After a few minutes of silence, Eric asked, "You said his actions could be considered justified. What could we do with that to ruin his reputation?" Ezekiel gave a wicked grin as he said, "While him killing your father might be argued as justified, he completely hid the truth. As far as the rest of Wakanda is concerned, Jobu mysteriously disappeared and was never heard from again." Ezekiel's grin became wider as he said, "King Chakra also abandoned you to fend for yourself in the United States. He justified leaving you behind because he was afraid of the repercussions of taking a child back to Wakanda who was not a pure-blooded Wakandan. He was mostly trying to maintain the royal Wakandan bloodline by preventing half Wakandans from being mixed into it." Eric had a frown as he asked, "You think that would help ruin his reputation? What if the other people in charge are just like him?" Ezekiel shrugged as he said, "It might work, it might not, but I am pretty sure it would ruin his reputation with his kids. His son Chala and daughter Shuri are pretty forward-thinking people. I would consider that a pretty big win myself." Ezekiel turned the computer monitor towards Eric as he said, "As for the other leaders, you could have the border tribe leader on your side if you bring him a gift." On the screen was an Interpol file for Ulysses Clow. Ezekiel smiled as he said, "This is Ulysses Clow. He worked with your father. Your father gave this man info about Wakanda. It was how he was able to get into Wakanda and steal vibranium. When he did, though, he killed a lot of people. One of them was the current border tribe leader's father." Eric nodded along as he asked, "So what? We find this guy and bring him to Wakanda to get inside?" "Pretty much. Plus, we need to pick up what your father left you." Eric looked a little confused as he asked, "What are you talking about?" Ezekiel gave a smile as he said, "Ulysses Clow stole the vibranium for your father. Your father had plans for it, but unfortunately he was never able to collect it. As far as I am concerned, that vibranium is yours." Eric gave Ezekiel a considering look before he said, "So you want that vibranium for something?" Shursway, who was sitting close by reading a book, said, "I told you." Ezekiel let out a sigh as he said, "Yes, I have a need for it. It was one of the reasons I wanted to talk with you." Eric shook his head as he asked, "So all of this was so you could ask for some vibranium someone else has?" Ezekiel shook his head as he said, "No, I told you before I was going to help you. I won't take that back. It is the same reason I was going to ask to have the vibranium. I consider it yours, and I won't take it from you if you want it." Eric was quiet for a moment before he asked, "Okay, so what happens if I say no?" Ezekiel shrugged as he said, "Then I will have to find some more, or steal it from Wakanda. Then what if I don't want to give it away? What would you trade me for it? What would you want?" Eric thought about it for a while before he said, "I don't know." Ezekiel sat back in his chair for a few moments before Shursway spoke up and said, "Ezekiel could set you up on a date with Ino if you asked. You've glanced her way over a dozen times now." Eric became a little darker as he said, "No, I haven't." Ezekiel shot a glare at Shursway as he said, "Stay out of this. You aren't helping." Shursway looked up from his book and gave Ezekiel a grin before he went back to reading. Ezekiel let out a sigh as he asked, "So what do you want to do?" Eric shrugged this time as he said, "If you really help me ruin Chakra's reputation, you can have the vibranium." "Deal." Eric took another glance towards Ino before he asked, "So what is the plan? Find Clow and the vibranium? Then what? Do we go to Wakanda?" "I already found Clow and the vibranium. If you want to go to Wakanda after I have Clow, we can." Eric looked a little surprised at that as he asked, "When are you going to take care of Clow?" Ezekiel shrugged as he said, "I'll probably do it as soon as we are done here, since he is currently with the vibranium. So we'll go to Wakanda tomorrow then?" Ezekiel turned his computer monitor around and typed on his keyboard for a few seconds before he said, "No, we'll go tonight. With the time difference, it will be nice and early in Wakanda. But keep in mind, you will be doing all of the talking in Wakanda." Eric looked a little confused as he asked, "Why will I be doing all the talking?" Ezekiel smirked as he said, "Two reasons. The first is because you are technically a prince of Wakanda and I will be acting as your guard. The second is because they won't listen to some foreigner." Eric thought about it for a few moments before he nodded his head and asked, "Since we are going to Wakanda, is there anything I should bring?" "Your father's ring. Other than that, you should be fine. How about you go rest up and my team will take care of Clow?" Eric nodded his head again as he stood up. He gave another quick glance in Ino's direction before he said, "Just come grab me in my room when you are ready to leave for Wakanda." Ezekiel smirked a little as he said, "That was the plan?" As Eric started walking away, Shursui said, "Not gonna say goodbye to your girlfriend?" Eric just picked up his pace a little as he walked out of the room. VVVVV. Ezekiel was standing on the top of a derelict ship as he observed the ship Clow used as his main base of operation. It was just past 2 in the morning. Clow and his men had just finished unloading a shipment. Ezekiel looked over at the 4 other people with him as he asked, "What do you think is the best plan of attack?" A man with silver hair wearing a white and red mask shaped like a wolf glanced over to Ezekiel as he said, "Fast and quiet. We will go around the outside and work our way in while putting everyone we run into a genjutsu. Are your hinge seals in place?" Ezekiel nodded his head in reply, as 2 of the other people did the same. The man in the wolf mask said, "Good, then let's start." Each person disappeared from their spot the next instant. Within moments they had all crossed to the other ship and started their mission. Tao was still standing on the deck of the other ship as she watched Ezekiel and his clones almost teleporting from person to person. Each one they met would freeze up for a moment, then they would relax and go still. With 4 people using Jinjutsu on normal people, it took minutes to go through all of the outside guards. It was a little harder when they moved inside. They had a lot of random rooms to check, and while the body flicker technique was great to use in open areas, in closed spaces it was terrible. You would be moving so fast it was hard to stop and make quick turns. So stealth was used inside the ship. Ezekiel let the others take care of that part, and it didn't take long before everyone except Clow and his personal guards were dealt with. Ezekiel and the others quickly rushed the guards at that point. Once they were under a Jinjutsu, Ezekiel adjusted his mask before he knocked on Clow's door. A second later, the last guard stationed inside the room opened the door. He was put under a Jinjutsu also, and Ezekiel and the others walked into the room. As they did, Clow, who had headphones on while working on his computer, asked, "What do they want, Alec?" When Ezekiel stopped in front of Clow's desk, Clow finally looked up. He glanced at Alex still standing frozen next to the door, and then he looked at the 4 people standing in front of him, all wearing different-looking red and white-colored masks. Klaus smiled as he said, "How can I help you, gentlemen? I assume you are here for weapons?" As Klaus was talking, his right hand moved slowly away from his mouse to reach for the gun hidden underneath his desk. He moved his other hand faster to act as a distraction as he went to remove his headphones. But before his right hand could get too far, a weird-looking dagger thudded into the desk right beside it. The man standing in front of the others said, "If you don't want to lose your hand, keep it on the desk." Clow moved his hand back to his mouse as he smiled bigger and said, "Sorry, habits. So what can I help you with, Mr. Vibranium?" Clow's eyes widened just a little bit as he took another look at the men before him. Even though they had masks, he could still see their skin. He relaxed a little as he said, "I might have some laying around." "Good, I want it all." Clow frowned the tiniest bit as he said, "You know that it's worth 10 large for a single gram?" It also came at great personal cost. As he said the second part, he reached up to rub his neck. "How much do you have?" Clow started to type on his computer for a moment before he smiled as he said, 2.8 billion. Rounded down a little if you buy it all. A few seconds later, a cell phone on Clow's desk started to beep. He looked at it for a moment. His eyes went a little wide before he looked up with a smile as he said, "I like it when my customers are decisive. Let me show you where it's stored." Clow was still cautious and slowly stood up from his desk. He started to walk towards the door as he asked while looking at his personal guard, "Are my guards going to be all right?" "They will be fine once we leave." Clow nodded his head as he asked, "Is that some kind of new weapon? Is that something you are selling?" Clow just shrugged it off after a few seconds of silence as he asked, "So how did you hear about me anyways? I normally only get referrals from people I have dealt with before. Who told you about me?" Clow started to hum when he didn't get a reply. After a few minutes of walking, they showed up to a locked bulkhead door with a keypad. He entered a code and then slid it open. Inside was filled with barrels that had "toxic" written on them. After a moment, the whole room started to move down, and as the barrels disappeared, a new room appeared with a bunch of small containers filled with a blue type of metal. Clow walked inside and grabbed one. As he handed it to the only person who talked, he said, "A word of warning, some people might come after you. If you flash that stuff around." The man nodded as he said, "I am not worried about Wakanda." He looked up at Clow as he said, "You on the other hand, you should be worried." Clow tensed up just a little, but let out a laugh as he said, "I've been dodging them for years, I will be fine." The man shook his head as Clow felt his body relax uncontrollably. Clow could still see and hear, but his body was frozen in place, and he couldn't talk. The man walked past Clow into the vibranium storage room as he said, "Not anymore."